election. What's his excuse? He's got no excuse, yet he can't even say what he knows that our elected leaders need to do. But the takeaway from this interview is that inflation is not going away. It is here to stay, and it is going to get worse. So all these numbers are just noise. All the people who are looking for some evidence that inflation is going away, they're wasting their time. It's not going away. The evidence will never reveal that as long as we have these big budget deficits. And by the way, they reported during the week, they got the deficit for the first half of the fiscal year. And this is the official deficit that they admit. And it was $1.2 trillion in 6 months. That means you're looking at $2.2 trillion, assuming the next 6 months are the same as the first 6 months. They'll probably be worse. Even though you got some extra tax revenues coming in for income tax. But anyway, because the government usually gets a little bit more revenue, right, in April because they get people paying their taxes. But I still think that the second half of the fiscal year could end up with a bigger deficit than the first half because more of these low-yielding bonds are going to mature. And they're going to have to start paying higher interest on that debt. But the point is, these deficits are huge and getting bigger. And so that guarantees that inflation is here to stay and it's going to get higher. Because how are these deficits going to be financed? We're not going to get tax hikes on the middle class, even if they pass tax hikes on the rich, and they haven't even been able to do that. But even if they do that, it's barely going to raise any revenue. And in fact, it may backfire and lose revenue. They're not going to cut any spending. I mean, even the Republicans aren't willing to cut any spending, right? So no one's going to cut spending. No one's raising taxes. So how are they going to pay for these deficits? Exactly the way Warren Buffett said they will, by creating inflation. Secretary of the Treasury, former head of the Federal Reserve, she was on CNN, and I was watching an interview there. And she actually admitted in a conversation that America's decision, the Biden administration's decision to weaponize the dollar and sanction Russia the way it did, that action was putting the reserve status of the dollar in jeopardy. She recognized that. She said that this is creating an incentive for other countries to move away from the US dollar over time. Maybe not that it would happen immediately, but that it would begin the movement out of the dollar. But in her mind, it was a risk worth taking because she said this is a very important tool and we use it very sparingly and only when we have consensus among our allies. But the fact that she would even say that it's worth putting the dollar status at risk shows you how little she appreciates the tremendous benefit that the United States enjoys as a result of that status and what would happen, the severity of the consequences if we lost it. But maybe they see that it's happening because they don't want to act like they were completely blindsided. But the main reason that Janet Yellen said that she didn't think it was a serious threat in the short run is because she says that there's no other country that has a currency that the world could use in replace of the dollar. And maybe she's got a point there. But what Yellen is overlooking is that they don't have to use another currency. They've got an alternative that is better than any currency, and that is gold. And what is going on? Read the news. Central banks around the world continue to be big buyers of gold. Why are they doing that? It's not an accident that they're doing that. Central banks are talking about moving away from the dollar, and so they're buying more gold because they're going to rely on real money, not the dollar. But I read a story, and I saw this video about Walmart decided to close down 4 stores in Chicago. And the reason they're closing them down is because they're losing money. Right now, why are they losing money? Well, I think, number one, Chicago exacted all kinds of demands on Walmart, just I think to allow them to open up. I think they required certain things in their wages and their hiring practices, which ended up being problematic for Walmart. But more significantly recently is the crime. I mean, there's widespread looting going on. There's so much theft in these stores that they can't make any money because so much of their merchandise is getting stolen. Right. And so they're saying, look, we're out of here. We're closing these stores. We're losing a bunch of money. We're closing these stores. Right. So I watched this video and you got this huge group of protesters in Chicago. Right. The government, right? These are, elected officials and maybe workers, and they're all protesting and they're blaming Walmart. They're saying this is a disgrace. Walmart should be ashamed of itself. How dare they leave, right? And they're saying we deserve, to have a place to shop in our own community. We deserve to have jobs in our own community. What do you mean we deserve? Nobody deserves anything. You have to earn stuff. I mean, this is a perfect example of the entitlement culture that we have created here, this welfare state, where people think they deserve stuff. Why? Because you're here, because you were born. You don't deserve, you have to earn. That's what you get. Walmart is a private company, right? The people of Chicago got lucky that Walmart decided to open up these stores so that they had a place to shop. And they had jobs that were created by Walmart. But why did Walmart go in to Chicago? Because they thought they could make a profit. If they didn't think they could make a profit, they wouldn't have come in, right? They're not a charity. They're a business. They're owned by shareholders who want to get a return on their investment. They're risking their capital, right? Buying into Walmart. They could buy into something else. And so Walmart goes in there, they try to make a profit, and they can't do it because of all the terrible rules and regulations that have been passed by a bunch of socialist politicians who run the city. And then because they don't have enough police or they don't care about crime, everybody starts stealing. I mean, I was thinking to myself, when they're saying we deserve a store where we can shop, they mean we deserve a store where we can shoplift. How dare Walmart take away all this stuff that we're stealing? Because what are we going to steal if you don't have any stores anymore? Like, they have a right to steal. Of course they don't. This is the mentality. I mean, this city is just going to implode if that's what people think. Everybody there thinks they're entitled to something for nothing. Well, you know what? You're going to get nothing. You're going to get nothing but crime in that city.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here at Drake University. It's great to meet with young people. If there's any hope for the country, it's going to be with you. This country faces a lot of problems, and a political campaign is a time when we can discuss those problems and discuss alternatives. If you're very happy with what you're having and you're satisfied with the politics of the day, then I'm sure you wouldn't even be here. You wouldn't be interested in politics, and you certainly wouldn't come and visit with a candidate that has different views. Different views because they're not the common views. They're not unusual views. They happen to be the views of the Founding Fathers. They happen to be the traditional American views, but they just don't happen to be the conventional views of the current day, mainly because they're not taught in the universities. We have been taught now for several decades that the government's purpose is to regulate and run the economy, to tell people how to live and tell all other countries how to live as well. We have accepted the idea of interventionism. Interventionism in the economy, interventionism as far as the personal lifestyles of individuals go, as well as this idea that we know what's best for everybody. And what has it gotten us? It's gotten us a runaway deficit, $220 billion per year, a national debt of $2.5 trillion, a stock market that has just crashed, inflation that is uncontrollable, interest rates that are too high, a housing market that's crashing, and who knows what it means for you in the next year or two when it comes to getting a job.
They admit once again, none of that's true. The New York Times just outed the kid. This guy's a kid, 21-year-old. The kid who was the leaker. He has been arrested because that's what we do when people leak information about evil things that the government's doing or that the government's lying to people. There are severe consequences for people like Bradley Manning, now known as Chelsea Manning, for Julian Assange, for Ed Snowden. Those guys, you get real punishments for. The leaks say like that we saw during the Trump administration. The leaks, let's say, of the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. Who was that leaker? We don't know. There has been no mass effort by the FBI. There's been no effort by the New York Times and the Washington Post to try to locate that leak, right? And you would think that's a much easier one to pin down. There's not that many Supreme Court justices. They don't have that big of a staff. There's only so many people who would have had access to this information, but there's just no effort to get to the bottom of that. This, however, when you're dealing with like the entire, whatever, National Guard, Air Force or whatever, this they get to the bottom of in a second. So now there's a few interesting things about this. So now all that nonsense about Russia being behind this has all completely been dropped. Nobody's saying that, much like with everything that they claim is Russian disinformation. Yeah, it is until you figure out that these are just U.S. officials lying to the American people. And of course, these media outlets they are to be mouthpieces for them. They don't even there's no editorializing within the article. There's no, it's just presented as they always do. This is what the New York Times does all the time too. They say something as like a statement of fact. And then after it say U.S. official claims. So if you're reading it, it's designed to give you the impression that this is the news, and then just like with a tagline of claims a U.S. official. However, the journalist this is true. They've claimed these things before, and they turned out not to be true. And there's no So this is a few days ago, and now a few days we find out that what these U.S. officials were saying was all complete lies. And there's no effort from Reuters to write a piece about how we're being lied to by U.S. officials. Now, I know they speak under anonymity, but there's no one in Reuters going to go, we will not use them as a source anymore in the future. None of that happens. It's just as if it didn't exist. We just move on. Well, that bullshit didn't work. Let's see what's next. And what's next is now they've outed this guy, and he's been arrested. And so now the entire tone of the corporate press, where they're going with this, has nothing to do with Russia anymore. Now it's all about just smearing this guy. He was a really bad guy. They're claiming he's racist and he's a gun enthusiast, and that what they actually say, if you look into it, they're making a bunch of claims about him. I don't know. It's impossible to tell. You certainly can't trust these people at all. Obviously, their goal when they were reporting that this was Russian disinformation, their goal was to challenge the credibility of the things that were, of the classified documents that were leaked. Obviously, now their goal is to paint this guy as a bad person, but it's very clear that they're just doing the government's bidding. Of course, the war criminals who were exposed by Manning and Julian Assange, they all walk free to this day. The people who were involved in illegal spying on American citizens that Edward Snowden revealed, they still walk free to this day. Clapper, who lied under oath, saying that there was no mass data collection apparatus at the National Security, that he's said, I forget his exact terms, of NSA is not involved in any mass bulk data collection, something like that. Blatant lie. He still walks free to this day. And all of these people who have lied us into this war in Ukraine, then continue to lie to us about it, they're also still free. But this kid is arrested. And on top of the fact that he's going to be, held in brutal conditions for many years, he'll also be completely smeared by the corporate press. It's just absolutely disgusting. Every one of them. This is the case for every one of these wars. They're always completely built on a house of war propaganda. And you could think about, if you think about through the war in Afghanistan, for 20 years, government officials were telling the American people that the military we're building over there is great. that we have really created this democracy, and man, this military, we've trained them so well, they're going to do such a fantastic job. We did that for 20 years, and they folded in a day. Like, it's not just that they'll exaggerate what's going on, they will completely mislead you. And then they complain about, disinformation. 0 for 75 on all of these predictions. They're always just to a point where you go, it's impossible for me to believe that they actually believe any of the stuff that they're saying at this point. Because I think they're just literally shills for special interests, and they know exactly what they're doing, and that none of this was the plan. Because this is literally what they said in Iraq, that we would be greed. And I'm not saying, I'm not lumping Victoria Nuland in with these people. This is Robert Kagan's wife. This is her husband, is the guy who wrote the Project for a New American Century in whatever it was, 1997 or whatever. Okay, it was like the neocon Bible that we followed, pretty much to a T, and it's been a disaster everywhere. Stuff about, NATO expansion and military, wars in the Middle East and regime change in Iraq and all this stuff. But when we went into Iraq, that's what they said, that we were going to be greeted as liberators, that it would be a cakewalk, and that it would be paid for in oil. Like, so the war wouldn't cost us anything. It would be easy, and the people would love us. They would be happy that we were there. Meanwhile, we got into almost 2 decades of guerrilla warfare because we weren't greeted as liberators. We were greeted with a rebel army. We were greeted with an insurgency that lasted for years. And it wasn't paid for in oil. It cost trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. So, a little bit off from what they said. And it's the same thing here with Ukraine, that they said that this was the Maidan Revolution, as they call it, was going to liberate the people, that joining the EU was going to bring prosperity to the country, and of course, that ultimately joining NATO would bring security to the country. And look where they are. It's the thing that's so tragic about this is that the people who, support these neocon policies, and the people who put the Ukrainian flag in their Twitter bio and all of this stuff, they claim they're like standing up for the people of Ukraine. They have a right to defend themselves, and we have to stand with them. And what do they actually have? What are you actually giving these people? Just prolonging this war? Because that seems to be the plan here. Like, the neocons think that the strategic value in this is that they can bleed Russia dry. So, okay, they're saying it can hurt Russia, but they don't believe this nonsense that they're saying. And there's no way they could. I mean, if they do, they'd have to be so delusional. I mean, imagine like predicting the consequences of war 14 times in a row, and it's 180 degrees the opposite of what you predict. Like, you predict it's all going to be roses and sunshine, and it's all death and destruction and babies starving to death. Okay, every single time. And then the 15th time, you're just as confident making that prediction. Well, if you're not lying through your teeth, then the level of delusion is like otherworldly. So, okay, they're saying everything's going to be fine. No, what they're doing is they're trying to bleed Russia dry, and they're willing to sacrifice the Ukrainian people in order to do that. Earlier than that, it started in 2014. But if you can't honestly, one of the things that all of the political leaders, this has been one of my big arguments about this from the beginning, is that all the political leaders always use the term unprovoked. And there's a reason why they do. It's a reason why these liars always have to say unprovoked. That Vladimir Putin led an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, the unprovoked war. Every one of them. They're like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton, all the people in the press, all the freaking Republican establishment, they all say it's like this unprovoked war. And the reason they have to insist that it's unprovoked is because it was so clearly provoked. Like, it's so obvious that it was provoked. And if you admit that, it doesn't excuse Vladimir Putin, but it does at least put some of the blame on them. It's like, it's even weird that they would have to use the word. Like, I don't know. Why would you even need to say that it was unprovoked? Wouldn't that be the assumption? If you're saying this guy's such a bad guy, it's like if you're throwing rocks at a dog and then he snaps and like killed a bunch of people. And when the dog snaps and kills a bunch of people, you have to constantly say, this dog snapped and killed a bunch of people and no one threw any rocks at him. No one threw rocks at this dog. By the way, you're telling the story to the cops. What happened with the dog who attacked those kids? Well, let me start by saying no one threw rocks at him. That's the first thing I want to let you know. It's like, right? Isn't it almost like, it seems like something someone guilty would say, but they all repeat this line. But missiles were fired into Poland and killed a couple people. Okay. And that was Zelensky. That was Ukraine that did it. But there's been no response to that. And of course, the Nord Stream pipeline was a serious attack on a NATO country, like an act of industrial terrorism and an environmental disaster, which also all these people, I guess, don't really care about that much. All of a sudden, their environmentalism just goes away because it's weird how it's always the warfare state first with all these things. That always is the number one priority. Always seems to be the military-industrial complex, and then all these other issues come second. But yeah, those were both attacks on NATO. Article 5 was never invoked, but those were the attacks on NATO, and it wasn't Russia that did either of them. Just something to keep in mind, I suppose. Something to keep.
So it isn't esoteric, it isn't theoretical politics that we're talking about. We're talking about the real McCoy. We're talking about what's going on in this country. A lot of people know there's something wrong. They certainly woke up last October and when the stock market crashed. When the stock market dropped 500 points in one day, Washington seemed to perk up their ears. Wall Street certainly perked up their ears for thinking there was something wrong. But you know there's an explanation for all that. It's just not a mysterious thing. It's not bred into the system. The socialists, and especially the Marxists and even the interventionists, would have us believe, and I'm quite sure that most of your economics classes will teach, that that is a natural consequence of the free market system, that you have to have boom periods and bust periods. But that happens to be a consequence of a bad monetary system. It's correctable and it's preventable. So therefore, we have to think about those things that might change things. I first got involved in politics a few years back. I am a practicing physician. I deliver babies. I'm an obstetrician. I finished my residency in 1968. I opened up my medical practice down in Lake Jackson and practiced medicine there for about 5-6 years before I decided there was something wrong. At that particular time, during that period of time, some financial events were occurring, especially in monetary affairs, which was the breakdown of the international monetary standard, that is the Bretton Woods Agreement. Because the Austrian economists, those are the free market economists, predicted that we would be moving into an era of very bad times with a high inflation rate and a violent business cycle and even recession or depression. I became fascinated with this, and they became convinced also that they had the right explanation. So in 1974, I announced I would run for Congress. And of course, I was the pessimist, and I was very negative about it, and very sarcastic, and said, nobody cares, nobody will listen, nobody will pay any attention. I went before the people in Texas and presented the views I'll be presenting to you tonight and talking about free enterprise system, individual liberties, civil liberties for the individual, as well as a non-interventionist foreign policy. And quite frankly, I didn't think anybody would pay any attention. I ended up being elected to Congress for 4 times. It was rather disruptive to my medical practice, to say the least. But it was fascinating because I had to really take a stand which was quite opposite of the status quo of Washington. In some ways it was exciting, it was very interesting, but it was also a bit nerve-wracking in time because there were times when I'd have to vote in the Congress. It would be 420 to 1 because my opinion was different.
Here's the most startling excerpt that under the former Twitter ownership of Jack Dorsey, the United States government had full access to all the communications on Twitter. Even if you sent a private message from you to another Twitter user, not the public message, the United States government was aware of it and saw that. Now, how the heck did that happen? Well, they didn't hack into Twitter because that would have been a federal crime. Not that that stopped them in the past. We know that the best hackers in the world are agents of I shouldn't say the best, the most prolific hackers in the world are agents of the federal government. They, of course, engaged in a relationship with Twitter, whereby Twitter gave the federal government of the United States access to your private communications if you use Twitter, which I imagine most of you do. This is a problem that Judging Freedom and a lot of us on the libertarian side of the world have been talking about for a couple of years now. The federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI has gone to big tech and cut deals with big tech, whereby big tech allowed the feds access to communications that all of us thought was just being seen by big tech and by the people at whom the communications were aimed. What favors did the government do in return for big tech? What non-prosecution was there? What carrot? What stick was there? What right did Twitter have to reveal the contents of all of your communication with the federal government? And who in the federal government? Was it the FBI? Is this a fishing net thrown out there to see what fish they can pull in? Can the FBI just throw out fishing nets just to see if anything criminal comes back? No, it cannot. The Fourth Amendment has been interpreted clearly and unambiguously by the courts. The police can't even run your license plate without articulable suspicion, the ability to articulate some suspicion about you. No criminal or investigative procedure can be commenced in the United States of America by any law enforcement agency without articulable suspicion about the person who is to be the target of that investigation. That was written. The implication is in the Fourth Amendment. It's been interpreted that way because the government in this country cannot just start a criminal investigation against anybody it wants. So why does the government want all of your private communications? Why did Twitter, the former Twitter under Jack Dorsey, not the present Twitter under Elon Musk, why did Twitter enter into this symbiotic relationship? Here's Twitter, my one hand, and here's the federal government with my other hand. What's going on here? I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to that. As you know, I applauded Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter, even though he claims it's only worth $22 billion now, and he paid $44 billion for it. He knows how to deal with that. But my hat is off to him and off to my friend Tucker Carlson for revealing that the feds have done this. And the feds must be bitter because they're locked out of Twitter. They're private bulletin boards, and the government should have nothing whatsoever to do with it. You like TikTok? You like that sort of fast 90-second off-the-wall way of communicating? Use it. You don't like it? Don't use it. You don't need the government to tell you what to use and what's dangerous for you. The whole purpose of the First Amendment is to keep the government out of the business of speech. Okay. First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Today, that means no government shall make any law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Federal, state, local, executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch. The courts can't silence you any more than the legislature can. And the legislature of Montana, every member of that legislature took the same oath that I did when I became a judge in New Jersey. What? New Jersey and Montana? Yeah. The Constitution of the United States requires that every public official in the United States, from a school board janitor to the president, from a National Guardsman to a governor, every public official in the United States of America takes an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Obviously, you take other oaths. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the state of New Jersey when I became a state judge. These legislators in Montana take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the state of Montana. My point is that they took this oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution, which includes the First Amendment. Government shall have no involvement in the content of speech, which includes the Commerce Clause. Congress regulates commerce, interstate commerce, and commerce with foreign nations. The states do not do so. That's pretty basic. First year constitutional law, con law, constitutional law 101. And the legislature of the state of Montana should understand that. Shame on them for not. I have applauded his work on the Supreme Court. I've applauded to the skies his decision in the Bruen case. That's the right to keep and bear arms, which re-identifies the Second Amendment as a first-class right. It puts it in the same category as the First Amendment. The Second Amendment protects, doesn't grant, protects your right to keep and bear arms. Where does it come from? According to Justice Scalia, not in Bruen. Justice Scalia was dead when Bruen was decided, but in Heller, the right to keep and bear arms is a modern extension of the ancient right to self-defense. You can use the same means to defend yourself that the bad guys use and that the government uses. That's Heller. Bruen is you can carry the same weapon that the bad guys do and that the government does. Okay, if you're convicted of a crime, there's going to be a violence, there's going to be some restriction on your ability to carry. But if you don't have a criminal record, every state in the union now is a shall carry state, meaning the presumption is that you have the right to carry. In states like New Jersey and New York and California and Illinois, the presumption was that you couldn't carry. You had to prove why you needed to carry the weapon. Thanks to Bruen, the Justice Thomas opinion. Back to Justice Thomas in a moment. That presumption is now switched. The presumption is now that you can carry and that the government shall issue you the permit. And if they don't want you to carry, they have to prove to a judge and jury why you shouldn't. I don't think you should need a permit anyway. You don't need a permit to own a printer. You don't need a permit to run a podcast. You don't need a permit to print your political views. Why should you need a permit to keep and bear arms? Why? Because if the bad guys take over the government, in some places they have, the first thing they're going to want to do, and in some places they try and do this, is to take your guns away. Okay, Justice Thomas apparently has been receiving lavish vacations from a billionaire and didn't report them.
You know, what would you think of a politician today here in Iowa that would deliberately vote against any special interest or special funding for the state or the district? Well, you say, he's crazy. Besides, that's what I want. I want to get the funding. You know, I need the funding for the farmers. I need the funding for the students. I need the funding for the highways. I need the funding for this. But to say that that is not the purpose of government, you would say, well, that's not a very popular stand. We don't care about this so-called oath that we take. They swear to uphold the Constitution. What we're concerned about as citizens is we want to know what we're going to get. We're going to send the congressman there to get what he can. Well, that's the way the system generally works. But I sort of defied that system. I went up and voted, and when it came to the special projects, even for my district, I opposed them on principle. But lo and behold, to my surprise, instead of that making it very damaging to me in my political career, the last time I ran for Congress, my political opponent, my Democratic opponent, dropped out of the race, which meant that I could have stayed and presented these ideas, because people will respond in a positive way if you explain to them why you're doing it and what you're doing.
Future historians may say that the most significant event of 2023 had nothing to do with Donald Trump, other 2024 presidential candidates, or even the war in Ukraine. Instead, the event with the most long-term significance may be one that received little attention in the mainstream media: Saudi Arabia's movement toward accepting currencies other than the U.S. dollar for oil payments. After President Nixon severed the last link between the dollar and gold, his administration negotiated a deal with the Saudi government. The U.S. would support the Saudi government, including by providing weapons. In exchange, the Saudis would conduct all oil transactions in dollars. The Saudis also agreed to use surplus dollars they accumulated to purchase U.S. Treasury bonds. The resulting petrodollar is a major reason why the dollar has maintained its world reserve currency status. Also this year, China and Brazil made an agreement to conduct future trade between the countries using the country's own currencies rather than dollars. Brazilian President Lula da Silva has called on more nations to abandon the dollar. The de-dollarization movement is driven in part by resentment of America's foreign policy, including, in particular, the U.S. government's increasing use of economic sanctions. Dethroning the dollar from its world reserve currency status makes it easier for countries to ignore these sanctions. De-dollarization will negatively impact the U.S. government's ability to manage its own $30 trillion debt. With a few exceptions, there is still no real support in Congress for spending cuts. Republican leadership members may say they will not support a debt ceiling increase unless it is tied to spending cuts. However, after the Biden administration accused the Republicans of wanting to cut Social Security and Medicare, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy declared a reduction in spending on Social Security and Medicare, big drivers of the federal deficit, off the table. Similarly, despite the growing skepticism of foreign interventionism among Republicans, the military-industrial complex maintains a vice-like grip on congressional leadership and the White House. Therefore, do not expect any reduction in military spending. Instead, the Pentagon's budget will likely increase. The Federal Reserve will face continuing pressure to monetize ever-increasing federal debt and keep interest rates and thus the federal government's borrowing costs low. The resulting inflation will lead to more support for ending the dollar's world reserve currency status. As more countries abandon the dollar, the Fed will become less able to monetize the federal government's debt without creating hyperinflation. This will result in a dollar crisis and an economic meltdown worse than the Great Depression. This crisis will lead to the end of the welfare warfare fiat currency system. While history suggests this will lead to the rise of even more authoritarian political movements, the growing popularity of libertarian ideas suggests the collapse will also fuel the further growth of the liberty movement. This could mean that the crisis leads to a restoration of limited government and an advancement of liberty. The key to taking full advantage of the opportunity presented by this crisis is to keep spreading our ideas. Fortunately, we do not need a majority. We just need a tireless, irate minority committed to the cause to regain our liberty. Thanks for listening.
Once I built a railroad, I made it run, I made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower to the sun, brick and rivet and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suits, gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee Doodle Dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell. I was a kid with a drum. Say, don't you remember? They called me Al. It was Al all the time. Say, don't you remember? I'm your pal. Brother, can you spare a dime?
Fantastic. That was a treat.
The libertarian message is very precise. There is a concept of government that is different than the concept of government today. It blends with what was written in the Constitution. And that concept is that government should be limited. I mean, if you look at the Constitution, you will find out that most of it says the government shall not have power to do such and such. And if the power isn't given to the government, they can't do it. And I took that oath seriously when I took an oath that said I would uphold the Constitution. Now, the libertarian says that he bases the principle on the fact that we promised never to use aggression against another individual. That sounds easy. Most people in this room would agree. Yeah, I agree with that. That means we're not going to use violence. We're not going to steal and rob and cheat and do these kind of things. Everybody believes in that. But we take that same principle of non-aggression against another individual and we apply it to the government. Now, that's the part which seems so strange. Oh, no, we know it's wrong to steal from our neighbor, but our congressman, that's his job. That's his purpose. I mean, we don't really care about this oath of office. What we want to know is how much he can get back for us. How many things can we get? How much money can he get? And every popular politician, if you ask him, what did he do for the district? Does he say, I got you more freedom? I got you less taxes? No, he says, I got such and such project for my district. As long as that's the measurement of the success of a politician, you can expect the economy and the political system to get much, much worse. And you're going to pay all the bills because you're young.
Well, it was their deal. I mean, they were the ones who helped to do it. I mean, it was John Kerry more than them, but still they were in on it.
Yeah, so you don't have a deal there. You know, we don't see much of a push for diplomacy in Ukraine. You don't see, Yemen was pretty much stagnant until the sudden breakthrough that, I think the evidence is China facilitated that. And, so you really, you look at, North Korea, nothing there. I mean, there's major warnings coming out about escalation there. I can't even keep all of the conflicts, the potential threats and risks in my head at one time. There's just so many. So, we don't even have a return to, say, Obama policy on Cuba. Or even Obama policy on Venezuela. It's all still mostly Trump policy with regard to those. So it's just really, amazing how poorly this team has done as far as the Biden team has done as far as diplomatic achievements that reduce tension or reduce human suffering abroad.
When they went back
really
to
stunning.
Yeah, they went back to Obama's policy on North Korea, where they could have built on the progress that Trump was making, and instead they went back to the permanent cold shoulder and increased tensions there, more military exercises and all that.
Yeah, I mean, so it's just, this administration, you hope that someone could get through to Biden and say, is this really what you want your legacy to be? Do you really want your legacy to be one where tensions escalated in almost every, either were maintained or escalated in many, almost every area. And I don't think that's what his intent was. I mean, I think he did have growing skepticism, over the recent decade or two about things like Libya, things like Syria. And yet, I think it is a lot of there are a lot of these unelected bureaucrats that have their own agenda, and it's certainly not an agenda that really any normal person, any normal American can understand or see as valuable. And so, yeah, and then you have, of course, major escalation. We're still continuing to escalate with China as well. So you just have across the board escalation, and you hope it is at least a huge relief to see that there's another actor in the world that is promoting peace. For as repressive as China is, and for their many flaws, at least their impact as of now seems to be positive in the international arena. And so we're very lucky in that sense for that, because otherwise, if it was a totally unipolar world and this was all we had, it could be in a very dangerous place.
So something has to give. Now, why was the political message of less value 10 or 15 years ago? Because we were still living on borrowed time and borrowed money and a lot of wealth. This country has been the wealthiest country ever. We have been the freest country, and we've been very, very prosperous. We had the strongest currency. We had the most gold. And what is happening today, 1988? The deficits are out of control. We have borrowed to the hilt. We are the largest debtor nation in the world, and we're facing serious problems. The currency is weak, and something has to give. No longer can we live on past accumulated wealth. No longer can we continue to borrow from around the world. That's coming to an end. It's an end of an era.
Bogdan announced Sunday that he marked Orthodox Easter by ordering more than 100 Ukrainian POWs freed, and this is according to Reuters. Per the Associated Press, Ukrainian presidential advisor Andriy Yermak confirms the Easter prisoner swap. He said 130 Ukrainians and an unspecified number of Russian troops were on their way home. Yermak says the exchange includes fighters captured by both sides in the area around Bakhmut, where both regimes report an uptick in the tempo of fighting as of Sunday. Apparently, it's getting really the fighting's continuing, but apparently over this weekend it got really brutal. While neither side seems to have seriously considered an all-out Easter truce after Ukraine rejected Putin's proposed 36-hour Christmas truce, large prisoner exchanges are always a good sign that could come before more wide-ranging negotiations. All right, the next one here, Russia's Pacific Fleet conducts weapons tests. This is also from Connor Freeman. The Russian Navy's Pacific Fleet is set to carry out various weapons tests, and Russia's Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced this on Friday. Moscow's drills come amid heightened tensions in the region, as well as numerous large-scale war drills led by Washington and its allies. There's a lot of military drills going on all over the place right now. So the weapons tests and combat exercises are being described as an inspection of Moscow's Pacific Fleet. Shoigu said, quote, the main objective of this inspection is to increase the ability of the armed forces to repel the aggression of a probable enemy from the direction of ocean and sea, end quote. Forces, so according to Chief of Staff General Valery Gerasimov, the Russian Navy will be put on high alert during the drills, and one of the primary goals of the exercises is ensuring the strategic nuclear submarines combat readiness. So again, lots of exercises going on in the Pacific and all over the place. Organization. The next one here, this is from AFP. Iran court jails 10 troops over the 2020 Ukraine jet downing. So Iran has sentenced 10 members of the armed forces to prison after finding them guilty of involvement in the downing of a Ukrainian airliner. So Iranian forces shot down Ukraine International Airlines flight PS-752 shortly after its takeoff from Tehran on January 8th, 2020, killing all 176 people on board. Most were Iranians and Canadians, including many dual nationals. So they really have punished the Iranians responsible for this. The commander received the penalty of 10 years in prison. They said he defied orders in shooting down the plane. 9 other personnel were sentenced to between 1 and 3 years. So the commander of a Tor M1 surface-to-air missile fired 2 missiles at the airliner contrary to orders and without obtaining authorization. All right, large-scale war games this week. They're doing more. This is from Kyle Anzalone. Over 100 American and South Korean warplanes will take part in large-scale joint aerial war games. The military exercises come as North Korea warns of a realistic chance of nuclear war. On Monday, 1,400 soldiers will begin participating in the 12-day war games. The military aircraft will involve advanced fighter jets, such as the F-35 and F-16. Chief of Staff of the ROK Air Force Operations Command, Lee Bom-ki, said, quote, through this exercise, we will be able to reaffirm the solid South Korea-U.S. alliance and further develop the combined operational capability to another level. Washington and Seoul have conducted a series of war games in recent weeks. In mid-March, the U.S. flew a B-1B bomber over the Korean Peninsula. And then they had their full Eagle War Games, and it was the largest live-fire military drill in South Korea in 5 years. In April, Washington conducted anti-submarine operations with Tokyo and Seoul. Shortly thereafter, the White House ordered a B-52 bomber to fly over the peninsula. Pyongyang has reciprocated with weapons testing. North Korea claimed that they successfully launched an underwater drone capable of creating a nuclear tsunami.
The interesting thing about 1988, I was asked to do this in 1980, 1984, and I said the time wasn't quite right. 1988 is the right time to present these views, the alternative. The Reagan era is gone. It's over. So no matter how much you might believe in the Reagan revolution and the Reagan era, it's over and done with, and it failed. I was a Reagan supporter. I went to the convention as a Reagan delegate in 1976, and I championed so much of what he said, but I championed nothing that has been accomplished. Nothing has been accomplished. The tax bill, I would concede that was a good bill, that tax rate reduction, that's okay. But revenues have gone up, spending has gone up, the deficit has skyrocketed, the national debt has skyrocketed, our intervention overseas is worse than ever, our defense is no better than it's ever been, and the interference and the invasion of private lives, whether it's financial privacy or personal privacy, is worse than ever. So therefore, we are now being challenged, not because I say so, and not because the libertarians are here, but because the era is ending. The bankruptcy is here, and we are delivering this wonderful gift to you. And you're going to have a choice as young people what to decide. You can put up with what you're doing here and just keep working, because you're going to have to work awful hard. You're going to have to pay a lot of Social Security into a system that you're probably not going to get anything out of. And you can pay a lot of taxes, but you'll never pay off the debt. And if we are moving into a slump, you're going to have to worry about where you're going to get a job. So it's very, very important. If the stock market crash had meaning, which I believe it did, we have to decide, well, what do we do to prevent a depression?
And it's always been like that, and it comes to the wars too. I mean, remember they called it the Rummy Show when Donald Rumsfeld would get up there and go, I don't have to prove that Saddam's friends with Osama, and give some riddle about you know what you know and you don't know what you don't know yet, and that's good enough for everybody. They loved it. But so, I don't know, I was born against these guys, no matter what. How come the journalistic field is full of people and institutions that are so biased toward the state? I mean, they get some scoops here and there, of course, but it's almost always still from the government's point of view, you know?
Well, two things really struck me as I was researching this book. One was just how little daylight there was on issue after issue after issue between government accounts of foreign conflicts and U.S. involvement in them and what purported to be news accounts. Most of the news accounts turned out to be little more than rewritten official statements, position papers, or press releases by the CIA, the Pentagon, the State Department, and with regard to the nexus between domestic security and foreign affairs, the FBI. And that's making news outlets into propaganda conduits, not independent monitors of government behavior. The other thing that struck me was how often the news media portrayed complex foreign conflicts and foreign disputes as morality plays, with all evil on one side, whatever side the U.S. government was opposing in another country, and all innocence and nobility on the other side, the one that Washington was supporting. Those characteristics stood out time and time again on foreign policy issue after foreign policy issue.
All right, so let's pick on Woodrow Wilson, because I hate him even though he was dead long before I was born, but he's the father of Joe Stalin and Adolf Hitler and the Bush family fortune for starters. So tell us about his propaganda campaign during the First World War.
That was a textbook example of how public could be conditioned to support an extreme policy, one that would have had very little support before the war broke out. And yet the herd mentality took over. I would even argue a lemming mentality took over, and that was actively fostered by the press. You know, the press was the Wilson administration's conduit for mobilizing the American people to hate everything German, to regard this war as a crusade, as Wilson put it, to make the world safe for democracy, and that anyone who opposed that was guilty of sedition. Now, some of this sounds rather familiar in our own time, but it was especially intense during that period, and it has left scars on this country, deep scars. The most noticeable one being the continuing existence of the Espionage Act of 1917, which is being used today to harass critics who dare reveal government secrets or government misconduct. So that was an episode. Wilson indeed was the father of so many of the problems that our country faces today.
Yeah. Well, and it's no accident. I mean, he was a bad person who believed in horrible things. And so guess what? It turned out that the way he behaved also had horrible consequences. I mean, him and all of his people. It's just amazing to think. I forgot exactly the context. We were joking the other day about Colonel Edward Mandell House bragging that, oh, yeah, well, I anticipated Mussolini by several years back, when Mussolini was popular and House was jealous. But that's who those people were. And then so, yeah, it's no surprise that that's how they acted. And then that's the legacy that they left was real fascism in Europe, the kind that makes, American style blush. And then the war and the whole world empire ever since then. It's, the Republic of Dishonesty, the empire lies, as Ron Paul called it. And I blame him. And you know what? It's funny, right? Because he was not the worst. If it hadn't have been for him, we might have gotten to World War I even earlier, right?
Well, Theodore Roosevelt and a lot of his followers were pushing hard for U.S. involvement in the war within weeks after the outbreak in Europe in 1914. So Wilson talked a good game right up until he was safely reelected as president in 1960. And then the tone changed, and he pushed the U.S., pushed Congress to declare war in April of 1917.
Yeah, I know. I heard him on NPR talking about China the other day. They just take it for granted. Oh, all this increasing of tension could lead to a Cold War. Well, it could lead to a hot one, but they can't even imagine that. They can't just say it could lead to a war.
That's one of the problems that I'm amazed at the casual nature with which U.S. officials, other Western officials, and the Western news media regard reckless proposals that could easily trigger a shooting war between the United States and Russia or between the U.S. and China. And yet they act like this is just purely an academic exercise. There's no real danger of the conflict between NATO and Russia, for example, escalating into a direct conflict and one with nuclear implications. Their minds don't seem to grasp the seriousness of that danger. And they instead act like this is, I guess, some kind of war game where nobody's going to die.
Mm-hmm. The inflation of the money supply, which is the basic cause of the boom period, was twice as much under the Reagan administration as it was in the 1920s. So it's not surprising to find out that the stock market crash was twice as bad. That means that if we don't do the right things, or if we continue to do the wrong things, you can expect the depression to be twice as bad also. So that means that you not only have an obligation to think about this in theoretical terms, but you have an obligation to decide about this for very practical reasons. And what are the questions you have to ask and then try to find answers, which you should be doing in this election year because it's a critical election year. The questions you should ask me and ask yourself and ask the other candidates is something fundamental, not what am I going to get? There's no more getting, there's nothing there left. Government gives you nothing. Government only takes from one person and gives to somebody else. So never let anybody use the fact that government's going to give you something. Only taxpayers People who are productive give you things because they have things taken away from them. So you have to ask, we have to reassess our values. This is the point of 1988. There will be a reassessment. There will be a realignment. But it could be in a dangerous direction, or it could be in a very healthy direction toward freedom. The question is, what is the role of government?
In 2001, after Bush took power, there was one of these rhinos from the Northeast, a guy named Gilbert, switched parties from Republican to Democrat and gave the Democrats the majority. In other words, the opposition party had the majority in the upper house of Congress. Yes. And what they do? They helped lie us into war too.
Correct.
And Joe Biden, with John Kerry and Hillary Clinton, did everything they could to whip the rest of the Democrats to support that war.
Because there is just one party in Congress. You can call it either the war party or the big government party, but it subsumes about 90% of the members of Congress. There are some courageous progressives, wrong hand. There are some courageous progressives on the left, and there are a few courageous libertarians on the right. But for the most part, it's the spend money we don't have, kill because it makes us look stronger, regulate because nobody cares about the Constitution, call it whatever you want, big government, war party, doesn't matter whether you have an R or a D. After
By the way, Judge, too, it's such an important point what you're saying here about the contradiction, where their law applies to us in the severest ways, but it doesn't apply to them for whatever they do. Well, it's the same with the world empire, too. And the rest of the world feels the same way about the situation as we do when we watch a cop get away with murder, we watch a politician get away with lying us into war, and they say, the Americans have this public relations line that the whole, American world empire is actually just the liberal, rules-based world order, that America enforces the world law selflessly in order to create this, fair and balanced type of a free trade zone for the world and further, integration of nations as in commercial relationships and all this stuff, and that it would all fall apart if we didn't, and that none of this is about us. This is only about helping everyone else, and yet everyone can see that America breaks the law whenever they want. If they can't get a UN resolution to bomb Serbia and break off Kosovo, they'll just do it anyway. And if they can't get a resolution to invade Iraq, they'll just do it anyway. And if they feel like torturing people to death, they'll just do that too. And they'll just break any law and tell any lie, and the whole world can see it. And so
you are so intellectually honest, so courageous, and so valuable to this show. Deeply grateful every time you come on for the very direct, intellectually sound ways in which you articulate the excesses of the government and its violation of human rights and basic principles of natural law. Thank you so much, my friend. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Judge.
What is the purpose of government? Should the government be regulating and controlling the economy? Should they be in charge of a money supply where it has no meaning, no definition, and the politicians can print it? We have a system of government today that says the politician gets reelected by voting for things for the people. The more he votes for them, the more likely he is to be reelected. Deficits don't have any meaning because they send the bills to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve prints up all the money and creates the credit. Can you imagine giving the power of the printing press to anybody in this room? Everybody would call it counterfeit, would want to put them in jail. But what do? We turn it over to the politicians and the bankers. And yet the politicians and the bankers rate the lowest on the popularity scale. But we as an American people, and you and I, have to make a decision. Is that what we want from our government? Do we want them to continue to intervene and to spend and regulate and run a welfare state? Of course, the Libertarian answer is very clear. We don't want that.
On antiwar.com right now, report 200 U.S. military trainers are now in Taiwan. Isn't that great? Oh, the Taiwan News reported that yesterday. Isn't that great? How about U.S. sails warships through Taiwan Strait? Why not? I mean, after all, hey, bring the Chinese down to the Gulf of Mexico. And all of you fucking libtards out there who love war, all you pricks, and I can't say the other word, Democrats that voted to send all our money to Ukraine to fight the war, keep stealing our money and send it to Taiwan. Oh, and all you fuckfaces that hang out your Ukraine flags, now hang out the Taiwanese flags too, and shut your fucking mouth, go over there and fight. Join the 200 military trainers, because after all, I won't be able to sleep at night if China attacks Taiwan. Because if Datka is next, I'm little Lindsey Graham. I'll spew out the shit and fuckfaces will swallow it. Oh no, I'm that arrogant Blumenthal, that arrogant boy up in cunt etiquette. Yeah, him. Oh, the tough guy who said he was in Vietnam and lied. He lied his fucking ass off. Why? Because he's an asshole. No disrespect to assholes, because they have a positive function. He got all these fucking deferments. He's the same age as me. Oh, and then he got in the National Guard, Washington. One little piece of shit taking us to war as this nation's going down the crapper. The decline of America is in front of our eyes. This country's going down into the toilet. And the reason it's going down into the toilet is because we have shitheads telling us what to do and destroying our lives. Who's your favorite fucking shithead? I like Trump. I love Biden. Give me Obama. I'll take a Clinton up the ass. Oh, are you some chick? Obama, the Nobel Peace of Crap Prize winner. Little Georgie Bush, a daddy's boy. A little fucking murderous prick. I'll vote for him, yes, sir. Roll out the red carpet. This country's going down in front of our eyes. If we don't turn it around, it's over, and we can do it. As I keep saying, it does not take a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority. Keen on setting breast fires of freedom in the minds of men, said Samuel Adams. And I am that irate, tireless minority, and so will everybody listening, and most of you. Except the ones that like my language. I don't like your language. It's proper language, shithead. It's situational language. When you're in a fight, you don't say, oh, please, don't hit me. I'm AOC. I'm okay with you. Anyway, going on to the Trends Journal. U.S. corporate profits falling fastest since early 2020. I'm just giving you just some tiny little bit of what we have here. Trends on the global economic front. When the economy falls, jobs go with it. Our 35th week. You should see what's coming down. Yep. Debt pressures mounting for poor countries. What does it mean? Hey, you think you got a refugee crisis now? And again, going on. Venture funding plummets 53%. Huh. Oh, spotlight on China. Spotlight on bye-bye bucks, the death of the dollar. Spotlight on the office building bust. We were the first to call it. We called this 3 years ago. Now it's making the news. And they're just about that much into the implications. This thing is going to come down big. It's going to come down hard. What to do, where to go, what you may want to invest in. We do not give financial advice. It's all in your Trends Journal. Again, a whole big spotlight on the office building bust.
We want what was intended in this wonderful experiment. Freedom. Freedom has only been tested that much in all of history, just a small amount of it. The best experiment was here, but the test is running its course. And if we don't reassess our values, and if we don't reassert them, you can expect this experiment to disappear. And that's what this is telling us now today about the stock market crash and the financial crisis that we're on the verge of. So what should the role of government be? If it isn't to regulate the economy, and if it isn't to tell you how to be a better person, what is the purpose of government? Well, we have to start off with a fundamental premise about rights. What are rights? To me, individual rights means that every one of us has a natural, God-given right to our life and to our liberty and to the fruits of our labor. And government has the only obligation, the only reason we bring government into effect is to guarantee that you have a right to your life, the right to your liberty, and the right to the fruits of your labor. And that's it. But most people now think, well, government's there to give us our freedoms, to provide for us, to take care for us, to give us food stamps, build our houses, give us medical care, give us an education. And this whole idea of rights has been completely distorted in the 20th century.
Those who hate the market, hate private property, hate capitalism, they usually hate advertising too. Those on the socialist commie left, they blame advertising. Oh, you just like that product because it was advertising. Oh, you only think she's beautiful because you see the magazine covers and that's why. It's false, because if advertising was the key to riches, then no business would fail. All you would have to do is advertise. So it's much, what advertising is to alert you of a product and to find out, these companies, they spend on R&D, they spend money trying to figure out, they have focus groups. What do people want? What do people want? Do you like this versus this? And then they advertise based on what people want. It's much easier and less costly than to try to force people, this is what you want. This is what is beautiful. And that's what wokeness is. Wokeness is trying to force people into a certain ideology, and it does not work. You can't force people to like a certain thing or to think a certain thing. They have their own opinions, whether you like them or not. And this go woke, go broke is true. And that's what's stunning about this is hasn't Bud been paying attention? And those who are going woke are losing money. People do not want this stuff, and yet they do it anyway. And it's shocking because, man, people care about their money. They do not want to lose money. Yet this wokeness, they're losing money seemingly on purpose. It's very fascinating. That just shows you how strong this ideology is with these people, that they're willing to throw away fortunes. Instead of having money in their pockets and having people throw their money at you, you're having them run away from you. It's such bad business, but this is that ideology. They hate business, so they're going to destroy business, and they're destroying their own businesses while they do it.
One thing about what's going on in the marketplace, and they do really dumb things. If you think about, say, energy legislation from the governor of California, why do they do this? It just breaks everything. And so much of that happens. Why do they run up these debts? And why do they start wars they can't pay for? And I've come to the conclusion that the one thing that helped me the most is that if you understand Marxism, the old type and the new part, they believe that in order for them to have their paradise, you have to get rid of this nonsense, corporations and marketplaces and, sound money and the Constitution, because you have to have chaos in the streets. I'd say they're doing pretty good. And then you say, well, you mean you don't think they're dumb? Yeah, they're probably dumb, but they're also quite satisfied. I mean, why should the people put up with somebody gets arrested 27 times in 2 days and then they never put him in prison and he's back on the street killing people? I mean, it makes no sense. And I keep thinking, well, how could I apply that to this? And the one thing is they put a rule out here. The individual that did it probably thought she was real smart and she wanted some bragging points. That might have been the biggest motivation, and really was naive enough to believe that the country was ready for her. But it also means, what if it happened that she was really into this stuff of cultural Marxism? The cultural Marxists aren't giving up their wealth and their privileges. It's you that has to give them up. So, but if they say, well, what could we do in this advertising thing to cause more chaos? And if we could get people really confused about what's going on with the beer, maybe they'll be fighting among themselves. The results were not quite different, but maybe they were just looking for chaos. And so I think so often there's always chaos. You can't argue about that. The thing of it is, you never know exactly what has been the motivation for them to do so many dumb things and have all these unintended consequences. Accidents happens and beyond their control. And that is why a free society and individualism is so much better. Does that mean the individual's going to take perfect care of oneself and the family? No, that's going to be a problem. But what happens if these scoundrels get into government and then they start running an entire state? And what if they want to run the whole country? And then they want to go, well, we'll move up to the World Bank and the IMF and we'll really conquer the world. And that'll be a good deal for the people, like fun. It'll be a good deal for them, and the people will suffer.
So when we lost our way by losing the definition of what rights are, then we literally set the stage in a philosophic sense for Republicans and Democrats to endorse one system of government, the government of intervention. Yes, different flavors and different weights on different interventions, but government intervention. And that's only a 20th century phenomenon, especially since the Woodrow Wilson era. Since that time, we have had the expansion and the rapid growth of the welfare state. That is, the transfer of wealth from one group to another. Those who produce must take care of somebody else, not because they're being generous, but because the government holds a gun at their head and says, if you don't pay your taxes, you're going to jail. It has gotten so bad now and has been so serious of problems in this country, we have more than a third of our people participating in the underground economy. Which means they say, I'm sick of it all. I'm copping out. I'm opting out of the system. I'm not going to pay the taxes and follow the regulation because I'm tired of it all. I, as a political activist, says that is not the answer.
Is there any other aspect about this you think we should go over or talk about here? I know there's so much to it, and we can really get into it. Like, he's being charged with the Espionage Act, but
I think one thing that probably might bolster the argument of some people who think it's like a total psyop and think that none of this story is true is the fact that it looks like the Biden administration is going to use this to kind of crack down on Discord and other they're going to increase internet surveillance is basically what reports have said in response to this. because that, I guess, private chat on Discord isn't subject to, government surveillance, but now it looks like they're going to make it so they can check those things and scan those types of chat rooms and other social media platforms that they don't look at too closely, I guess. So they're definitely going to use this to justify more internet surveillance and things like that. So there's that aspect of it. And, you see people, like if you read the New York Times and you look at the comments, people are like calling for this kid's head and saying, how could this possibly happen? That's what the reporters are asking the Pentagon. So you're right. That's what the story has become, is about this kid Teixeira and how this could have happened. And of course, they're going to use it to, crack down on the internet.
Yeah. Over the weekend, Dave, there was a whole article in the Wall Street Journal about how it's not a bad thing that we spy on our allies, and this is why the 702 program has to be renewed and everything. Trying to clean up and cover up there. So let's move on. I got this article here. You have say here there's a downside to U.S. sanctions, Dave. So what is Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, admitting here?
Yeah, so this was interesting. And Yellen said a few things like this. Basically, she acknowledged that U.S. sanctions, because of the nature of them, make the countries that are, are targeted by sanctions look for alternatives to the U.S. dollar. She says it threatens the U.S. dollar's dominance as a global reserve currency, which is, a very obvious point that, we've been making for a long time. And you're seeing it a lot more clearly now, especially with Russia and China talking about trading using the yuan. And we've also seen India talking about, trading with their currency with Russia to buy oil. One example I put in the article was during the Trump administration, Venezuela and Iran actually traded gas for gold. They used a gold, which is a currency the U.S. can't touch, although the U.S. did end up seizing some of those gas shipments, just straight up stealing them. And, when you're putting a big country like Russia that has a lot of resources under sanctions, it's obvious that this is going to happen, that other countries that don't really care about the sanctions will accommodate Russia to get, cheaper oil, like India. And Yellen also said recently that sanctions on Iran are, caused an economic crisis in the country, but haven't changed the behavior of the government, which is, again, another very obvious thing. And that's what happens with sanctions. Cuba is always the best example of that, because they've been under that embargo since 1962, but the government hasn't changed, just the people have suffered. So Yellen acknowledged that. And in both cases, she says, but we're going to keep doing these sanctions. When she was talking about the U.S. dollar dominance, she said, sanctions are still an important tool that we're going to use. And then when she talked about Iran, she said, we're looking at strengthening the sanctions. And when it comes to sanctions on Iran, there's not really much more they can do. So it's just interesting that she says these things, but then, they're just going to continue ahead with these policies anyway.
Yeah, right. If you want to more strictly enforce sanctions against Iran, you would have to lift sanctions on Venezuela and Russia and Syria, and bring those countries back into the fold and incentivize them not to do business with Iran. But Dave, when you sanction half the world, then that half of the world is just going to trade with each other, and that's essentially what the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has become, the sanctioned bloc of U.S. countries and all the other countries that feel like it's fair to do business with them. Let's talk about some China stuff before we move on here. You got this real important article report: 200 U.S. military trainers are now in Taiwan. Dave, why do we have so many troops on the island?
Yeah, so this is a big deal, and I haven't really seen it reported yet. Besides, I saw this in Taiwanese media that there's over 200 U.S. troops now in Taiwan, which is a pretty significant increase. The Wall Street Journal first reported back in February that the U.S. plans to send 100 to 200 troops to Taiwan. And over the years, since the U.S. and Taiwan broke off diplomatic relations in 1979, the U.S. has always sent kind of a few dozen military trainers there. I believe it's usually the National Guard or some sort of special operations or Marines to train them on the U.S. weapons that we sell them. But now, as the U.S. is looking to really increase ties with Taiwan, they plan. The Wall Street Journal reported that they plan to send these troops, and then Taiwanese media reported that they're there, over 200. And I asked the Pentagon about it, and they said they wouldn't comment, but they didn't deny it. They just said, but we support Taiwan. Kind of a standard answer that they gave me. So this is huge escalation against China. China has been really explicitly warning the U.S. against increasing relations with Taiwan, both diplomatically and militarily. But the U.S. is just going along right ahead, even though from China's actions and rhetoric, it's very clear that the more they do this, the more military pressure Taiwan is going to come under, which then justifies selling them more weapons and giving them military aid now. So it's kind of just this cycle of escalation between the U.S. and China over Taiwan.
The answer has to be, as long as we have the freedom to come together, people like myself allowed to express myself, to be running for Congress and to get elected and run for president means that we have to go through the political process of not disobeying the law, because a nation disobedient law cannot survive. But it is to change the law, to get rid of the bad laws, to obey the Constitution, to have sound money, to have free enterprise, and to have your civil liberties. But to find the civil liberty is certainly different. So therefore, government is there for the guarantee of something which is a natural gift to you, a God-given gift to your life to be left alone. Therefore, the government cannot be in the business of welfare. So we, on principle, on ethical, moral, constitutional principles, reject the whole notion of the transfer of wealth because we consider it theft.
Going on. There was an interview that you did with Colonel Douglas McGregor last week that everybody should go to the judge's channel to watch. And it's, Judging Freedom. And to paraphrase what Douglas McGregor said, he said, they've been lying to us. He used those words. They've been lying to us. All of them have been lying to us about what's going on in Ukraine. And he said, the only way that this could change, it's up to the people. And the people can do it. They're lying to us in front of our face. And of course, McGregor knew it, we knew it, but now the people are starting to know it. So tell us more about this document release about the Ukraine war and the truth versus the lies.
There's two arguments or debates going on in the intelligence community. One is Jack Teixeira, the person the FBI says was responsible for these leaks, a criminal or a hero? The other is Jack Teixeira a mastermind or a pawn? Many of my intelligence community friends believe he's a pawn, that somebody much higher up in the intelligence or military hierarchy got this stuff to him without him knowing how they got it and knowing that he had a penchant for sharing documents with his chat room. Turns out that he's been sharing these documents with his chat room since December.
Wow.
The government did not know this until April, when somebody in the chat room let the cat out of the bag, gave it to a friend who gave it to another friend who was a Russian-born American naval intelligence veteran who recognized it for what it was, understood the Pentagon Papers, and posted it on this website called Discord. So there's a couple of steps from Teixeira to the publication of these documents. The question is, what steps are there on the other side of Teixeira? Did he just walk into a computer cubicle on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, type in his password and download this stuff? Or did somebody get it to him knowing that he had a penchant to get it out there? So that's one side of this. The other side of it is what was revealed is real documents, true and accurate documents that were prepared by the staff of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a review by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the head of the four-star generals, the head of each of the five military branches. And it revealed that their collective thinking is that Ukraine's air defenses have been horrifically degraded by the Russians. And by the end of next month, which is just 6 weeks away, June 1st, more or less, the Ukraine air defenses will be worthless. It also revealed their collective view that Ukraine is losing this war. Now, knowledgeable of that, Defense Secretary Austin, he a former four-star, he a former member of the board of Raytheon, as you point out, the second largest military contractor in the United States, lied when he told the Senate Armed Services Committee, things are going well, it's going to be a good spring for Ukraine, we expect Ukraine to push the Russians back in the winter. They expect the exact opposite. At the same time that Secretary Austin said this, Deputy Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland, she of the first Trump impeachment when she was in Ukraine, she the orchestrator of the coup in 2014 where the CIA provoked a coup to throw out Viktor Poroshenko, the popularly elected and neutral but leaning Russian president of Ukraine. She told a press conference the whereabouts of drones, the origin of drones, the location of Russian troops, the movement of Russian troops. All of this is top secret information. So we have Victoria Nuland revealing top secret information with the government's blessing. We have Jack Teixeira revealing government information. He's in jail charged with espionage. We have Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, lying under oath to the Congress. We have Jack Teixeira telling his buddies the truth. So which will serve the American public better when they decide whether or not to believe the government? Secrecy or the truth? It's not even a close call.
And we're sending billions of dollars over to Ukraine to fight a war that is absolutely of no consequence to we the people of the United States. And to make a bad situation worse, now they're ramping up a confrontation with China.
Joe Biden wants to run for re-election as a wartime president, Gerald, like his hero, FDR. And he's willing, that's how low his morality is, he's willing to sacrifice the lives of Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers to do this. What will he do when one of the Americans who's there, which these documents also reveal, comes back in a body bag?
He could care less. And again, what's not talked about in the media anymore is about these documents that have been released. It's out of the mainstream media.
Yes, it's out already. You're right.
Gone. And the reality of the Ukrainians losing this war, it's out of the media. It's nothing about Sir Cy Hirsch's information about the Nord Stream pipeline, gone out of the media. And you know, one of my sayings is when all else fails, they take you to war. And the American economy, this is very important. As the bet on the street, almost 90% that they're going to raise interest rates another 25 basis points when they meet again on May 3rd. People don't understand that it takes time for the impact of higher interest rates to hit the economy. And now they're going to hit the economy big time. You're going to start seeing a real sharp decline in economic growth and consumer spending. And when things get bad and people start getting angry about it, you're going to start seeing they're going to ramp up the war machine again.
Yes.
Get people's mind off it all the time. Again, what followed the Great Depression? World War II. What followed the dot-com bust? The War on Terror. Right. By the way, anybody can Google up Victoria Nuland, N-U-L-A-N-D, December 2013, which Dr. Paul Craig Roberts referenced, in her speech in Washington, D.C. about Ukraine with over one shoulder the sign of Chevron, the other sign ExxonMobil.
Good God.
Oh, yeah, you could Google it up. And this is where she's saying what we have to do in Ukraine and how we have to change what's going on there. She says it right there. And again, she's involved. Her husband is involved in this very ultra-conservative group. What's the name of it? Do you know?
No, but her husband is the prince of the neocons. I think his last name is Kagan. Robert Kagan is her
That's
husband.
it. Yep.
Right.
And that we have these clowns, these arrogant clowns. You look at her, and she's telling us what to do. And the latest, did you hear the 400 weapons that we're sending over to missiles or whatever kind of thing, top things to Taiwan? Just came out.
I didn't see that.
Came out.
Wouldn't surprise me if the Chinese intercept them on the high seas.
Again, the cover of this week's magazine, war with China, who will win?
Yes, I saw that last night, yes.
Yeah. Again, America hasn't won a war since World War II, and they wouldn't have won it, by the way, without the Russians, who lost what? Some 25 million people, Operation Barbarossa, and they were the first ones to beat the Germans.
Correct.
So they were the first ones to beat the Germans. There was 25 million people. How stupid can you be to think Ukraine is going to defeat Russia?
If you as an individual can't steal from your neighbor, why is it we have come to accept the idea that we can send our congressmen to do the stealing for us? So under those circumstances, you can expect nothing more than more problems and more deficits and more spending. The purpose of government should be to guarantee your liberty. Now, if we guarantee your liberty as an individual, that means you have civil rights to live your own lifestyle. You actually can do things that I might disapprove of, but I'm very tolerant. As a libertarian, I say, well, I might not endorse your lifestyle. You may smoke some things and drink some things and eat some things and act certain ways that I totally abhor. As long as you don't hurt anybody else, I'm not going to bother you.
And this is from Anti-War. Representative Gates' resolution would make Biden disclose the number of U.S. troops in Ukraine. Now, one thing I would qualify to start with is, in World War II, if Germany declared war against us first, and then we're in the middle of war, and we're preparing for retaliation and defending our country, it seems like there's a limit to how much you could demand. This is, to me, so different. This is sneaky war. This is ignoring the Constitution. And why don't you go ahead and make some comments on there, what you think about Gates' resolution?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is I think this is the first fallout from the release of these classified documents, which has essentially shown that, the media wants to only focus on the so-called leaker or suspected leaker. They don't want to concentrate on the contents of the leaks. What the leak shows is that the administration has been lying to the American people. The Secretary of Defense went before Congress and lied to Congress about Ukraine, and the leaks have shown this and demonstrated it absolutely clearly. And I think this resolution by Representative Matt Gaetz from Florida is the first response to that leak, and I think it's absolutely appropriate. And what it actually is, it's a privileged resolution of inquiry. And you remember those from your days back in the House, Dr. Paul, where you require the White House, the administration, to provide you with information about something. And this is part of the House of Representatives' oversight role, completely constitutional for them to do, hey, what are you doing? You need to tell us. And so what it does is two things, Dr. Paul. The first is that it forces the White House to send all documents, all documents outlining their plans for assistance to Ukraine. And this is partly in response to what we've discovered from this and probably from the Seymour Hersh article, demonstrating that even just in diesel fuel alone, apparently some $400 million has been skimmed off the top. So that's telling the White House, you need to bring us in on this. As we get closer and closer to being involved in the war, you need to bring us in. We need to know what's going on. And the second one is that it forces the Secretary of Defense to disclose the full number of U.S. armed forces in Ukraine, because one of the things we learned from the classified leaks is that there are American troops operating in Ukraine. We don't know, but more importantly, I guess, so to speak, Congress doesn't know how many are there and what are they doing and what kinds of tripwires might they be stepping on leading us to war. So it's an absolutely appropriate response to learning that the administration has been lying to the American people and to Congress about what they're doing in Ukraine. Congress, Congressman Gates, for at least showing some interest. And in fact, here's a quote he had, Dr. Paul, and I think it's a very good quote, and I'm going to read it. He says, the Biden administration and other allied countries have been misleading the world on the state of the war in Ukraine. There must be total transparency from this administration to the American people when they're gambling with a nuclear adversary by having special forces operating in Ukraine. It's well said, but it almost seems like a no-brainer. Why aren't you telling this stuff?
You know, then they get around and say, well, we don't have troops over there, and yet we have CIA, they're troops, and there's a lot of assassinations and things like that that go on, secretly like that. And then the special forces, that to me even sounds military, it is part of military, but they escape this detail. Well, we don't have troops over there, and they'll lie through it, and like I've said anyway, there's no remorse about being caught in a lie, because the slicker they are in telling a lie and deceiving the American people, that's how you get support, or at least you get silence. They're not going to fight it. So and we're always hoping that there will be a better coalition on issues like that with some of the progressives that have, not gone along with the warmongering stuff, joining with the libertarian-leaning individuals on the conservative side that would oppose this. So let's hope that develops. But right now, it's just more sneakiness, backdoor to war, and all that nonsense. Daniel, I want to go on to the next subject we have for today. I want to talk about economic sanctions, which we have talked about many, many times, because I feel very strongly economic sanctions and blockades and interference with trade and blowing up pipelines, they're acts of war, and we ought to recognize that. Yet we engage in it, and our government gets away with it. And if you say boo about it and they shouldn't do it, then you're accused of being a traitor to your country. Well, we'd like to dismiss that. The standing up for liberty in the Constitution is supposed to be what patriotism is all about. They have that all twisted around. But anyway, I wanted to deal with the subject of economic sanctions. So one of our favorite people who's been writing on foreign policy for a long time, Ted Galen Carpenter, he has a good article out today on antiwar.com, and it's entitled Economic Sanctions Are Simultaneously Ineffective and Cruel. And I agree with that. And the whole pitch on this is when you do it, if you're a superpower, you can get away with it for a long time. But getting away with it doesn't mean you get away with it forever. Eventually, it catches up with us, and that's what's happening right now. They're catching up to us because we've overdone it. We have a lot of enemies out there, and they're ganging up on us because they say that we want it to stop, and that is why they're attacking us through the financial system and the dollar, and we've made ourselves vulnerable to this. So this is a big issue. So I'm very anxious to talk a little bit more about the sanctions and what Ted's had to say. Ultimately, the greatest danger is it gets out of hand, and people become enemies of ours, and that is what's happening. We put a sanctions on so many countries, and now that we're weakened with our foreign policy and weakened with our economic policy and the dollar, they're delighted in participating with Russia and China and the various countries to go along with attacking the dollar. So that's a war that's going on. At the same time, the precipitation is the willingness to have this silent war. We had to face that when we were Congress. Saying that, the progressives were against putting the money into bullets and guns and bombs, but putting it on sanctions and economic sanctions, that was okay, which we considered a fallacy. It's misleading. They think they're doing something, which it eventually is just as harmful as if you were dropping bombs on people.
Yeah, I think the idiocy of sanctions is best encompassed in a nutshell in what Marco Rubio said, and we put it on the screen last week. He said, if all these countries keep ditching the dollar, we're not going to be able to put sanctions on them. So that's the only purpose. Yeah, the problem, unfortunately, in Capitol Hill is that a lot of the members who are saying enough is enough on Ukraine, their second sentence after that is because we've got to focus on China. And this is what we're talking about. And this again is from our friends at antiwar.com. The U.S. has sent over 200 troops to Taiwan. So we're sending troops over there. We're purposely provoking the Chinese. And we, the thing is, one of the things we learned from these leaked documents is that Taiwan has no chance against China. The military knows it. The administration knows it. The intelligence community knows it. They know that if Taiwan does something to provoke an attack by China, they're going to be eliminated. They're going to be extinguished. And you have to wonder, so why is the U.S. provoking this so much? If Taiwan is our best friend or our good buddies, why are we pushing them to do something that will get them annihilated? It's like you're in a pub somewhere and there's a skinny guy and there's a huge tough guy and someone is provoking the skinny guy. Go punch him in the nose. Go ahead. Go punch him in the nose. I mean, you wouldn't do that to a friend. If that's what we're doing to Taiwan, sending more troops, sending weapons, sailing our ships again through and through the Taiwan Straits. It doesn't make any sense, Dr. Paul.
That's Ron Paul, Institute for Peace and Prosperity, with a sincere belief that we will expect that there will be wars and there will be problems and there will be people lying, probably forever. But it doesn't have to be carnage of a whole civilization. And that's what a lot of people are worrying about right now. And the conditions that we have to change aren't that difficult. Some people get confused. Well, it's so big and overwhelming. What do you do? Well, my suggestion is that if you're really confused, the Constitution is pretty clear cut. You can read it as a hint on what we're supposed to do. And technically, it's still the law of the land. We're on the right track. So, but what bewilders me at times is if we're at least going in the right direction on this, isn't it a shame that we're not more successful? I mean, why should people be for peace and prosperity? And unfortunately, what happens is that too many people have been conditioned to think the government should, yes, that's true, we want peace and prosperity, but everybody has some needs. It turns out that people who have the loudest voice and maybe the most weapons is the military-industrial complex, and there's a lot of organizations that follow the routine of a military-industrial complex, scare the people, threaten them, and call them unpatriotic, and therefore you have to go along with the spending. And right now they're discussing this big thing in Washington about the budget. Well, the odds of them having a budget that really improves things, the Republicans have a few suggestions of doing it, but it's going to continue. It's locked in place until, since we haven't woke up gradually and changed our position, we will wake up suddenly, and we better decide what we're going to do after that happens.
You actually literally have the right to be self-destructive in this situation. But if government assumes the role of protecting you against yourself or protecting you against what you smoke, literally they have to get rid of alcohol and tobacco and caffeine and limit calories and put you all on exercise programs and all that. Complete nonsense. But we don't want that, so we just apply those principles across the board consistently to everything. As long as you don't hurt other people. Drinking is okay but drunk driving isn't okay. And there's a distinction between that, but we allow you to participate in activities that we might not ourselves endorse. So therefore, personal lifestyles are your own business, and also what you read and what you study and what you look at is your own business, and also your religious beliefs. We would never, as libertarians, ever conceive of the notion that some religion could be called a cult, and therefore you would have a different tax advantage, which is going on all the time, and we've prosecuted against certain religious cults because our government decides, well, they're not really religions. That does not happen in a libertarian society.
They can say anything. They could be like, oxygen's good for you. I'll be like, oh, screw that. I'm doing the research. Like, I don't know what you're trying to get me into, man, but I ain't buying it. It's just, I'm just so distrusting of the authorities. I just, and always have been.
Interesting. I do the exact opposite. But, you know, it just shocked me to think that someone intelligent just could entrust her whole future in life to whatever the authorities said she had to do.
That was the really strange part is people that are intelligent and that have been exposing government corruption for so long, suddenly just sort of like, no, they're right. They're right. Yeah. Wait. Hold on.
Yeah. And the mainstream.
I was just reading your article 2 days ago where you're pointing out how the government lied us into Iraq. And now you're telling me.
Yes. And as you said, like the mainstream media performed as sort of a government prop. The mainstream media is supposed to, like, their role in society is to push back, to act as a counterweight. But they did none of that. On the contrary, they propped up the story and they scolded anyone who questioned it in any form, even respected scientists. You know, it's one way to achieve consensus, as I said. You know, you silence all those who oppose the consensus. Well, of course, you're left with consensus.
There had to be. I heard you talk about like a type A and a type B when addressing this. What was the one thing that you learned the most about people?
I think people on either side talk about how they're disappointed in the human race. So, you know, I know people on the other side, on side A, like, I see them talking online also. I was so disillusioned with people. They thought people were more caring, but no one wants to wear a mask anymore. You know, and then there's people on my side who are equally disillusioned and think, you know, people want this kind of biomedical world. They want to turn the whole world into a hospital. They want to reduce human life to just safety. They want to discount all the things that make life, you know, interesting and meaningful. So I always come back to the same thing, that, you know, there's just different worldviews that fuel these different positions. I've never really deviated from that belief. And I think the big learning experience for me was that a lot of people don't think like me about this, and that a lot of people have a very different view of life. Even though I don't consider myself a religious person, it seems that my view of life is maybe a little bit closer to the religious view of life, because I have actually gotten to know more religious people since taking this position, and I've come to understand them better. So that's been very interesting to me, you know, because as I say, I still don't consider myself religious, but I just cannot identify with that biomedical view of life, which the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, which I feature in the book, he talks about that at all. I think that's what also shocked him, is this, he talks about bare life, how suddenly the world was so focused on bare life, at the expense of living, at the expense of meaning, at the expense of communion, all these things. And so yeah, it's, you know, it's something that I still sometimes shake my head and I think, you know, how did this all happen? You know, why were people so ready to go there? And I don't know about you, but I don't feel confident that it's not going to happen again. And I think that's why I wrote the book, and that's why I'm going to keep talking and writing about it, and that's why I think a lot of people at Brownstone as well feel the same way, that this is by no means over. We have to keep talking and writing about it, and just to raise awareness, to hopefully erect some barriers, you know, to this happening again.
Have you found that it's difficult for you to understand? Because what I've seen, and I'm coming from more of a libertarian standpoint, where I was watching, and it's almost like I saw this switch where the left went from being kind of anti-government to the government is our friend and we have to trust them. And it was like, the hell just happened? Totally. I think that's where Taibbi and Greenwald are coming from. They're like, wait a second, this has nothing to do with the left-wing issues or views that I'm familiar with. This is a completely different animal.
Completely agree. And, you know,
but the purpose then of government would be to guarantee that liberty, but what kind of a market economy would you have then? You would have to have a free market. You'd have to have a free enterprise system, because all associations, all transactions would be voluntary. The buyer and the seller has to come to a mutual agreement. The employer and the employee, two people get together and have a mutual agreement. Nobody is ever compelled to accept anything they don't want to. And once the agreement is made, they have to fulfill the agreement. There has to be some respect for the personal agreement. So what kind of an economy? There has to be a free market. Now, we defend that morally and constitutionally, but the magnificent part about this is the practical. And that is, that's the most prosperous society. That's why we have been the richest country. That's why, tragically, in many ways, the interventionists, the government people, the planners, the welfareists have gotten away with so much. It's because freedom has given us so much. But they're using it, but they've expended it, and now we're broke. So that's why the reassessment has to come in.
So at the best, the opponents could say, well, the court might decide that it's okay to send National Guard units into foreign combat without these authorizations, but they haven't yet. And you know, if that's going to be the argument, then I say let's have that battle in court. I'm more than happy to have it, because I think that the constitutional basis for declaring war is very clear, and maybe we could roll some of that back, because you know that's the whole problem that we're trying to address with Defend the Guard, is the fact that Congress doesn't do its job. It gives President the blank check to send troops anywhere in the world for any reason, and of course they do, and that was absolutely antithetical to what everybody in the founding generation thought. They did not want that power in the hands of one individual, particularly the individual who gets to run the wars. Because if you get to run the wars, you have a lot more incentive to start them. And they understood that. That's why they gave that power to Congress. Congress hasn't done its job. So what we're trying to do is trying to make Congress do its damn job. Then there's this other issue that comes up, and I think this one's a little bit more difficult and convoluted. I'm going to try to explain it as simply as I can. And that's this idea, it's called dual enlistment. And I think before we can even talk about it, we need to back up and understand what the militia historically is, or what it historically has been. The militia, as defined in the founding generation when the Constitution was ratified, was basically the whole body of people, and more specifically, able-bodied males, generally between the ages of 16 and 40. But it wasn't just a select group of people. Pretty much anybody who could pick up a gun and fight was part of the state militia. They trained, they could be called up to defend, you know, the frontier, to defend their communities. It was absolutely necessary in that time for everybody to be ready to go into a defensive military posture. In 1903, there was an act called the Dick Act, which you can make all kinds of jokes about that. But that was the act that actually organized the militia into today's National Guard. And basically what it did was it said, we're going to take this select portion of the militia, not the whole body of the people, but this select special group from the militia, and they're the ones that are can be called up into federal service. So that was the establishment of the National Guard. Now, if you read the Dick Act, it's very clear that this was all based on the militia clause in the Constitution. So everything that the National Guard does is guided and limited by those clauses in the Constitution that define when the Guard can be called up. And if you look at the Dick Act, it actually says specifically that the constitutional militia is where this authority is coming from for the federal government to create this body. Now, in 1933, there was an amendment to the Dick Act, and then they came up with this concept called dual enlistment. And basically what dual enlistment says is that when you are given an oath as a member of the National Guard, you're actually also duly enlisting in the federal military. So if you think about it, in effect, what it does is it erases the line between the militia and the standing army, right? The National Guard argues that when called into active duty for federal service, that the Guard members are relieved of their status in the state militia. And I think this actually was brought up in that main committee hearing. So they're relieved of their status in the militia and they become part literally of the U.S. Army. So consequently, they argue that the restrictions in the first militia clause no longer have application to federalized National Guard units. Now, this all sounds like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense. Here's the problem. In effect, what that amendment did in 1933 was it amended the Constitution, erased the militia, and created this new dual militia standing army hybrid. It doesn't work. It is incoherent legally within itself, if that makes sense what I'm saying. And what I mean is you can't have a militia that is in control of the state that can only be called up for federal purposes and at the same time have those same people be in the U.S. Army and no longer part of the militia. That's not a thing. They created a thing that there's no authority to create. And again, you go back to the Dick Act of 1903, it's very clear that the whole concept of the National Guard is based on the militia clause. So from a practical standpoint, it doesn't make any sense. And I think that if challenged in court and if somebody makes the argument in the proper way, I think there's at least a 50-50 chance that the courts are going to side with the Defend the Guard Act on this and limit that federal activation of those guards to get rid of this whole idea of dual enlistment. The powers that be, again, the adjutant generals in their cool uniforms and the National Guard spokespeople, they act like this dual enlistment is somehow, carved in a stone and handed down from Moses off Mount Sinai. It's not. It is a concept that they've come up with that has never actually been challenged in any way other than the Supreme Court case that I mentioned that held that the governors can't restrict the guard units from being deployed into foreign countries for training purposes. So all of that long story to say is they're making what sounds like a compelling argument, but when you dig into the legal weeds, it really doesn't stand up. And, I hate having to throw things into courts because you never know what they're going to do, and they do tend to side with federal power. But that doesn't mean you just quit trying to push forward this very important piece of legislation. I say, go for it. And then let's see where those cards fall. Let's have that debate. Let's have that battle. If we just back off now, we know what's going to happen. We're going to keep having our National Guard units sent off into unconstitutional wars, and there's going to be no pressure or incentive on Congress to reform itself and do its job. If we push forward with the Defend the Guard Act, maybe it gets overturned in court at some point down the road, but it will make a very strong point. It will put pressure on Congress, and maybe we'll get the reforms that we need, or Congress will do its job and actually debate sending our men and women off to die in these useless wars, and actually take some accountability for the decisions they make. I hope all of that made sense because it is a little bit of convoluted legal gobbledygook, but I think it's pretty clear if you look at the Dick Act and then that 1933 amendment, those two things don't work together.
I'm grateful. That's the silver lining of Vietnam. Is I knew better than to believe in that.
Yeah. Well, my grandfather would if you wanted to get him going, he was not one to talk about like his combat experiences, but he would certainly talk about the bullshit that he saw in Vietnam in terms of the politics, in terms of being someplace where they had no business being, someplace where they were not going to ever win. He recognized that, and he's like, I'm not doing this. And as a result, this man who was very proud of his military service, I mean, just a staunch conservative American, he was dead set against Iraq because he saw it for what it was. He said, this is Vietnam all over again. And that's like you said, that's kind of the blessing. Those guys recognize that. Unfortunately, they're starting to get to get older. We're going to start losing those folks and lessons learned. So they don't have to depend on the poor guys that were sent over as fodder in Iraq and Afghanistan and everywhere else.
Well, so talk about the guys from Defend the Guard and Bring Our Troops Home who are pushing this thing.
These guys who, and not just guys, men and women who were in Iraq, who were in Afghanistan, and hear them talking about their experiences, the mental toll of watching their best friend get his head blown off. It really brings the reality of what is happening home. And I think that's something that we don't really get as modern people. Like in World War II, pretty much everybody was affected in some way. So many people were sent off into that war. In the modern war on terror, it's really a select few who are sent off, and the rest of us, we're putting the blue, yellow ribbons on our cars and the flag lapels, and it becomes kind of this academic thing. Yeah, we're over there and we're bringing democracy and all the bullshit that bullshit is what it is that they throw out there. When you hear these guys, you get the reality of these wars, and that it's not just a policy thing. It's not just the Constitution or some kind of. This is real life people who have suffered and dealt with just amazing, horrible things for nothing. And to hear those stories, I mean, I was literally brought to tears a couple of times listening to what these guys endured. And it really brings home how important that this work is. Because again, it takes it away from being, an academic thing or a legislative thing or a legal thing, and it brings it down to a human thing. And that's really ultimately what we're talking about, right? We want to stop killing people all over the world. Not only Americans, but, Iraqis and Afghans and all of these folks who are suffering in these wars. We have the opportunity here to maybe not stop it, but at least to put some checks in place, to challenge it, to maybe slow it down. And when you hear those guys talk, it just becomes that much more important to keep pressing forward. And when you contrast what some of those guys say with, we may lose our funding, the we may lose our funding argument starts to sound really stupid when you put it next to the guy who, has suffered PTSD and almost committed suicide because of the trauma that he endured. So
the wonderful part about this whole philosophy of individual rights is that you will have an economy that will produce the greatest amount of abundance, the least amount of poverty and suffering. It's very clear if you look at the government records, the record of the government programs. If you have the government in housing, you get less houses. More people are homeless. If you give them food stamps, more people are hungry. If you give them medical care, the higher the cost of the medical care, the worse the medical care. If you have government running education, the worse the education gets. It's systematic.
a member of the German parliament. I don't know the fellow. It's a small minority party. His name is Rudiger Lukasen. We can't say that these weapons will bring victory to Ukraine or will lead to peace or even to a reduction of escalation. Therefore, yes, I would not send weapons to Ukraine, but would try to find an opportunity to start negotiations as soon as possible, because it cannot go on like this any longer. No one in the American Congress, no one in the British Parliament. I don't know if anybody in the French General Assembly has said it. This may be the first in the Bundestag to say it, but he said it, and it's out there.
Well, I think you had Mrs. Wagenknecht. She leads the hard left, who's made a similar statement, arguing for an end to the war. And that's essentially what this gentleman did. The AfD controls 15% right now of the votes, but it could double in the space of a few weeks, and it could overwhelm most of the opposition. They call it some sort of radical right or extremist. It's a bunch of nonsense. These people are just common sense right-wing conservatives. They would be very comfortable with us. And they're nationalists, and they respect the Russians for their interests, and they respect other people's legitimate security interests. So he's simply stating the truth. None of this equipment is going to change anything. This war is decided for all intents and purposes. And we're going to watch this happen over the summer. What is going to happen in Washington? I think Washington is going to be in the midst of a serious financial crisis. I think we're just at the beginning of that. And the more desperate we become on that side, the less interest we will have for what's happening in Ukraine or anywhere beyond our borders. The path is to stop spending, cut spending, and negotiate a new deal with your creditors. That's called default. We did that twice in 32 and 34 under FDR. We had no choice. We defaulted. We said, we're restructuring the debt. Well, this is the last chance, Judge, to restructure the debt. And the first thing you cut if you restructure the debt in spending, overseas military commitments. Quickly.
Right.
Halt.
I know you have been critical of President Macron. I'm interested in your view of what he said as he was flying from Beijing back to Paris, where he said the words to the effect of, Europe should not be subject to the American rhythm. I think he meant the American rhythm of endless wars. Where's France on this? Are the French providing troops or material, or is he worried about getting impeached if he gets France involved in this war?
Well, we all know that General Charles de Gaulle, when he became president, made similar remarks way into the 60s. That's one of the reasons he decided to pull France out of the military dimension of NATO. So they weren't part of that structure. Gradually, we've enticed them back in, first through intervention in the Balkans and Kosovo, subsequently in other places. I think he knows that that's a mistake. He probably has always known that, but now he's saying so in the hopes that he's going to get some credit for it. He's not. The population doesn't want to impeach Macron. They want him gone. If anything, he's on the path to becoming Louis XVI again.
This can be applied in foreign policy as well. If we're not interventionists with you as individuals, and you can do as you choose, and we apply this to economics and you have free market, if we apply this to the military and to foreign policy, you come up with the same solution. We do not interfere. We do not intervene for ethical, moral reasons as well as constitutional reasons, but what are the practical results? The practical results of a non-intervention foreign policy is a lot better chance for peace.
The Justice Department indicts 4 Americans for their political views on Russia. So the Justice Department has indicted 4 Americans who are members of the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement over their political views on Russia. And this step, of course, has very grave implications for First Amendment rights. So the allegation against these Americans is that they were involved in a foreign malign influence campaign directed by Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB. The DOJ also indicted 3 Russians related to the case, including Alexander Ionov, who was initially charged last year. So this Russian Ionov is a Moscow resident who founded the Anti-Globalization Movement of Russia, the AGMR, which is a non-governmental organization, an NGO. So the DOJ claims that this guy used this organization to conduct what they call Russia's malign influence campaign and recruited Americans to spread Russian propaganda. The indictment alleges that the Russians were involved in a 2019 local election in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is one city where this black socialist group, APSP, is based. So this quote from General Matthew G. Olson, he's an assistant attorney general, is really something what he says here. He says, quote, Russia's foreign intelligence service allegedly weaponized our First Amendment rights, freedoms Russia denies its own citizens, to divide Americans and interfere in elections in the United States, end quote. So he's saying that they weaponize the First Amendment and that they deny these freedoms in Russia. So in response to that, the U.S. is denying these freedoms to these 4 Americans. It's a very serious, thing that's happening here. So if you remember last year, it was over the summer, I believe, the APSP, the socialist group, they were raided by the FBI, and it was over their connections to this Russian NGO. So Omali Yeshitela, who's the leader of the APSP, he was indicted by he was one of the Americans indicted by the DOJ. He pointed out after the raid that his group has worked with organizations around the world for decades. This group has been around for a long time. And we actually published an article that he wrote on antiwar.com back in March. So he said, quote, at our first party Congress held in Oakland, California in 1981, we received solidarity statements from organizations and governments from around the world. This helps to give lie to the notion that our connection to a Russian NGO is evidence of an illicit relationship that we would have with a foreign power, end quote. So Yeshitela strongly denied that his group was working for Russia, and they appeared to have been targeted simply for their political beliefs. I can't think of any other reason why they would, the DOJ would try to do something like this. So the APSP has expressed support for Russia, and they denounced U.S. involvement in Ukraine, but this group has been speaking out against U.S. foreign policy since it was formed way back in 1972. So this is nothing new for them, and Yeshitela himself is 81 years old. He's been doing this a long time. So he said in this article that he expected to be indicted and that the government would likely use the Foreign Agents Registration Act, the FARA law, which requires people acting on behalf of a foreign government to register with the DOJ, but it's really a bogus law that wasn't used for decades and decades and is used very selectively. And now, since tensions have been high with Russia, they've been looking to use it more. So Yeshitela wrote, quote, this is selective prosecution. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee and other Israeli lobbying organizations are seemingly immune from prosecution under the FARA law, despite their obvious public function as agents of the Israeli government, end quote. So when I first read that, when I was looking all this stuff over, I thought he made a mistake there. I thought, no, the AIPAC, looking at this law, they must be registered as a foreign agent, but apparently they're not, which is really unbelievable. Even though they act on behalf of foreign powers' interests, they claim all their donations are private. So the fact that they're going after them and they don't, make lobby groups like AIPAC register, I mean, it's really ridiculous. And the indictment does not mention FARA, but it says, the press release at least that the DOJ put out doesn't mention FARA, but says the Americans and Russians are charged with, quote, conspiring to have U.S. citizens act as illegal agents of the Russian government within the United States without providing prior notification to the Attorney General as required by law, end quote. If convicted, they face up to 5 years in prison. And then Yeshitela and 2 other Americans are also charged with acting as agents of Russia which carries a maximum penalty of up to 10 years in prison. So they're looking at some serious time for their political activism. That's all this seems to be. I didn't read the whole indictment, but according, what I read from the press release, they're not alleging much. They're alleging that they had contact with this Russian guy, and he told them some things to say about the invasion of Ukraine in an email, which, there's nothing illegal there. And even if he is FSB, how would they know? If he's acting covertly as an intelligence agent, there's no way they can know that. But we haven't seen any evidence that he is, so we can't take their word for it. This just seems like they're going after this group, kind of to set a precedent here. You think about the precedent that could be set. As a lot of writers, sometimes, we get asked to write articles for, last year I was asked to write an article for a Japanese website, and, I said, sure, that sounds great. And I wrote it, and they paid me a little bit, and I didn't look into them that much. Who knows? Could they have been tied to a foreign intelligence agency? Probably not, because they didn't pay me much. But, you just never know. This could really set things up that they can really go after anybody that they want. And because this group, they're a black socialist liberation group, it might seem really radical to a lot of people. I think it's really important for us to stick up for them, no matter what you think about their beliefs, because this is such a serious indictment here. All right, the next one here. Representative Thomas Massie is working against the TikTok ban. So this is good to see. Massie, the Republican from Kentucky, is urging Republican leadership not to pursue legislation designed to ban TikTok. So in comments to Axios, Massie expressed opposition to the Restrict Act, which is a piece of legislation introduced in the Senate. It's received more than 20 bipartisan co-sponsors. It's supported by the White House. The bill does not mention TikTok, but it would give the Commerce Secretary sweeping powers to crack down on tech. If you remember when I went over that, it's very vague authorities. Basically, anything that it seems like the Commerce Secretary determines is a threat to national security or decides is something like that they could take action against. So it's a pretty serious bill. So Massie said, quote, "I've communicated very politely to our leadership here that if you ever try to bring a bill like that here, we're going to have even more problems in this chamber," end quote. So the Libertarian-leaning Kentucky congressman said that he is part of what he called a populist revolt against the Restrict Act. He said it's not just libertarians who are against it. So Massie called the legislation an excuse to grow the government. He said that he has no affinity for TikTok, but says that the cure is worse than the disease. So over in the Senate, another Kentucky Republican has been leading the charge against the TikTok ban, and that's Rand Paul, who has been really good on this issue. He blocked a bill introduced by Josh Hawley that would have just banned TikTok. It would have prohibited downloading the app on people's phones in the United States. And he was really good. He delivered a great floor speech. He wrote this op-ed about it. Really, the allegation against TikTok is that, they're owned by a Chinese company. That means the Chinese government can have access to our data. And Rand Paul makes the point that the fact that the company has been very cooperative, and they appointed this new board to oversee this data stuff, and they're really playing ball with the U.S. government, and is just going to make them like all the other apps that are in the United States that censor things that the U.S. government doesn't want to see. That's what it's turning into on TikTok. And they're giving all these guarantees about the data, saying it's stored in the U.S. because, as Rand Paul points out, they just want to make money. They're just another tech company, social media company that's just looking to make money. And they all vacuum up our data, and that's we're the product for them. And when writing about this, I always have to mention the fact that we know that the NSA has backdoor access to data from Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, basically all the stuff that we use thanks to the Edward Snowden leaks. So that's that. But again, it's good to see more dissent from Massie on.
We never fought any foreign wars prior to the 20th century. Something, happened in this 20th century. We changed our foreign policy. We changed our monetary system. We changed our tax system. Since Woodrow Wilson, we've had the income tax, we had the Federal Reserve System, and we had a foreign policy that Woodrow Wilson defined as make the world safe for democracy. Has the world been safe? Has it been democratic? It's more socialist communist than ever before, and we're broke. We can't even afford it anymore.
But when I first got onto roles, that was because the academic gatekeepers said, you have to read roles. Everybody must read roles, because if you don't, it means you're not doing it properly, which I resented. So you just have to wonder, if his idea is so good, why do people have to be forced into it? That's the question that I have. In fact, that's my opposition to the egalitarian schemes, is the fact that they are mandatory. They're not simply a suggestion for what people ought to do. So I don't know about your question about physicians, if we had enough. I don't even know how that would work. I think any proposal is fine. It can be put on the table as long as people aren't being forced into it.
Well, how would you define egalitarian so that it includes as many possible supporters of the idea?
To me, I include everyone who thinks that equality is a goal that we should be pursuing. So I think what you're getting at there is that different egalitarians have different ideas about the extent to which we should be pursuing equality. So some people say you only need a minimum amount of equality, and other people say no, you need total equality, and other people are sort of within that range, and they may disagree amongst themselves on how much equality is enough equality. But I would include them all within the same frame of people to whom I'm opposed when they say we ought to be pursuing that equality as a goal, because I think it's inherently totalitarian. I think even if people say we only want a minimum amount of equality, even for that, what they have to do to achieve it becomes tyrannical. That's what's wrong with it.
I don't suppose you saw this clip because it's an American politician and you are happily insulated from those, I hope. But there was not that long ago an exchange between television host Bill Maher and our perennial presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, who was asked whether his program fell more under the designation of equality or equity. And he needed clarification on this, so Bill Maher explained it and said, well, I understand equality as being the pursuit of a society in which everybody has an equal chance, whereas equity involves the results you get and making sure that the results are equal. So which side do you come down on? Well, he obviously comes down on the side of equity, but he's so confused, he said, oh, equality. Now, that is not his program, but he doesn't even know his own program. He doesn't even understand which side of this divide he's on. So he's a thoroughly confused egalitarian.
Well, I did see the clip, and he's confused for a reason, which is, in fact, there is no divide between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. They would like to make us think there's a divide so that people can say, oh, we support equality of opportunity, but we don't support equality of outcome. In fact, I would say the vast majority of people, if you ask them, that's what they would say. They would say we support equality of opportunity, but we don't support equality of outcome. But in fact, that's a false divide, because the way they achieve their so-called equality of opportunity is by testing and measuring gaps and testing and measuring outcomes. So they would like to make you think there's a difference, but there isn't. So even if you say we just want equal chances for everyone, which is equality of opportunity, some people say equalize the starting line, but don't equalize the result. But even if you say it that way, how would you in life ensure that everybody has an equal starting line? People don't have equal starting lines. We all start where we are. So if you come from a dysfunctional family, you don't have an equal chance at life than somebody else who comes from a stable family. So even if you say, well, we're just equalizing the starting points, even that is going to be incredibly oppressive. So the reason why people struggle to distinguish the two things is that it's a false dichotomy. And in fact, laws like the Civil Rights Act and what we've got here, the Equality Act, they said it's just going to be equality of opportunity. So that's what they're enforcing at the moment.
What a woman is. I'm sure you know about the film What is a Woman that's hosted by Matt Walsh. And Matt Walsh says some dumb things from time to time, but other times he's obviously right. You don't have to like him overall to admit that he's obviously right about this stuff. And yet we've gotten to a point where simply asking somebody to explain what a woman is viewed as a boomer-style troll. But how is that not a legitimate question? If you can't even answer that, or you think that being a woman is like a state of mind or something, then I think people need to know that, because that's not correct, and nobody thought it was correct, including most of the people advocating this view today. Even 5 years ago, nobody thought that.
Yes, and now, at least in the UK, where we have protection based on your gender reassignment, it's actually illegal to ask someone if they're a woman. You can't ask, like, if you see somebody approaching, let's say, the women's bathrooms, quite self-evidently not looking remotely like a woman, you can't say to them, hey, are you a woman? Because that's discrimination. It's unlawful. Or if they're marching into the girls' bathrooms or into the women's changing rooms or anywhere, you can't even ask them because the law stepped in and said that's discrimination if you do that.
Yeah.
So yes, it's not just that the ideas are crazy, it's also the fact, as I said earlier, that they're backed by the force of law. It's not just saying, well, this is bad manners. You know, what you're asking these questions, you're such a boomer. It's not just that, it's that it's unlawful. I think that's the idea of the Equality Act that they're proposing in the US. That's to extend civil rights to transgender people.
The thing is, once you've gone down the road of anti-discrimination law, it's actually very difficult to exclude future groups from it. Because if it's a good thing, and this group is suffering from discrimination, then what's the problem?
Yes, in fact, why would you? This is the point that I've been making. So in the UK, we have 9 groups of protected people. So it's race, sex, religion, this, that, and the other, including changing your gender. Well, why would you accept that certain groups need protection and not others? The minute you say people need to be protected, especially based on their personal identity, there's no logical stopping point. So it's not just transgender who are already in the law, and they're proposing to put that in the law in the US as well. But then you get these people who say, I identify as a different age. You know, like those people who say they identify as a baby, even though they're grown up. People saying you're protecting people based on their sexual orientation. Well, my sexual orientation is I'm attracted to children, so I want to be protected. There's literally no stopping point. That's part of the problem.
That is the problem. And I think it's a problem with progressivism in general, which of course is deeply wedded to egalitarianism. But you can't imagine a progressive saying, okay, we're all done. This is the society we want.
Yes.
Everything's that way. Now you can relax and not be constantly reacting to our wild new proposals. There won't be any more coming. You know, that's not possible.
No, it's not possible. There are all kinds of proposals, and I think we can even include the environmentalists in this as well. So it's like, okay, we've conquered the human world, and now we need to conquer the natural world. There's no stopping point.
Right.
We'll conquer the animal kingdom. We'll go and make wild animals behave better. There's no stopping point to it.
So as you say, you could get to a point where it's so obviously absurd or oppressive to other people that eventually people say, we don't want this anymore. The tricky thing is that you really are up against a massive existing establishment. And so what I think is in the short run more likely to happen is they will pick and choose and say, we're going to keep the anti-discrimination establishment the way we have it, and we're not going to add this group or that group to it, and try to maintain that kind of equilibrium. But I think that's an unstable equilibrium.
And they won't succeed. Do you think they'll succeed in keeping out the transgender lobby? They will not. They won't even try. Look at them, they're running scared. No, they have no chance of saying we're done with the protected groups, no more. See, here's the problem. The arguments are always the same. So first people say, oh, you keep women oppressed and it's terrible. You chain them to the kitchen sink. Let's protect them. And then it becomes, oh, you keep black people oppressed and they're all in chains. Let's protect them. And then it becomes sexuality. And they say, oh, this is exactly like what we used to do to women and black people. And then it becomes transgender. And they say, this is exactly what we used to do to. So that's why you would never succeed in drawing a line under it, because new groups will always say, but this is exactly like what you used to do to. Isn't that what the animal rights people say, for example, when they try to say you shouldn't eat meat? And people say, no, we always eat meat. And they try to say, well, isn't that exactly like in the days when there was slavery and we treated some human beings as if they weren't equal? Now we're doing exactly the same thing to animals. So that's the thing. You can never get to a point where you say enough is enough and draw a line under it. That's the problem. Like, he's not trying to say well, that's exactly correct. You can't draw a distinction between different types of women or different types of men. So that's exactly the point. If a man says, I'm a woman, like, he's not trying to say he's transgender or anything, but he just shows up and says, I'm a woman. Well, you have no reason not to admit him. You can't say, you aren't a woman. I'm looking at you and no, you can't do that. You can't draw a distinction between different types of women or different types of men.
It's very interesting how these propositions, which are highly controversial, to be generous about it, it's hard to know what percentage of people believe in gender ideology, but among the young people, it seems like it's pretty high. And why wouldn't it be? Because they get exposed to it all the time, and most people don't have the capacity for independent thought. I'm just being blunt about that. I'm totally not an egalitarian when it comes to that. I've seen how many people get dragged along by every single last social trend, no matter what it is, but it was certainly led by a small number, the imposition of gender ideology. This was not a mass movement of 100 million people demanding that we read texts in gender ideology and alter our society accordingly. It was a small group that somehow took this concept of equality and again used it as a crowbar to pry its way into one institution in America after another. And I don't know how to end this conversation on a note of hope here, because as I talk about it, it just seems so grim and frustrating.
It is grim and frustrating, but as I see it, that in itself is where the seeds of hope lie. Because as long as these things aren't that grim and aren't that frustrating, people just go along with it. They say, oh, well, it's ridiculous, but they tolerate it. They say, well, it doesn't hurt. Just call people whatever pronouns they want. I think the worse it gets, the more likely that people say we've had enough of this. I see the trend as a cause for hope.
Well, I would like to have a conversation where we actually look at, preferably your most recent book, Redressing Historical Injustice, and we go into the specifics of what your arguments are there.
But it's not a good policy because it doesn't work. It always backfires. And what do we do with the Philippines? The Philippines is a perfect example of the disaster of our foreign policy. Can you expect the Republicans or the Democrats to change it? No, it's identical. It'll stay the same. It's been that way for 50 years. And that is send money. And if it gets out of hand and the communists look like they're going to take over, send the kids. Would you let the Philippines follow the communists, they would say? Send the kids. Grab up the 18 and 19-year-olds. Give them a rifle. Go to the jungles. Go to the marshes of the Philippines. Save the world from communism without reassessing the values. Why is there a major chance for the communists to win in the Philippines? Because the Republicans and the Democrats have been sending money for decades to Marcos, a hated dictator who finally was kicked out. At the same time we gave money to Marcos, causing resentment among the people of the Philippines, causing poverty in the Philippines. Then we came along with another government intervention which made it even worse. That intervention was putting a tariff on the sugar so that they were then even more impoverished. No wonder there was resentment against the Americans. No wonder there's growth of communism. And now, what will the answer be? Republican or Democrat? Will be to draft the young people and tax you even more. Our answer to this is prevent it. Change the policy. Look at what the Founding Fathers said. Don't get involved in entangling alliances.
U.S. to sell Taiwan about 400 Boeing-made Harpoon anti-ship missiles. Taiwan will purchase 400 Boeing-made Harpoon anti-ship missiles under a contract worth $1.7 billion, Bloomberg reported on Monday. Taipei has previously produced ship-launched Harpoons, which are also made by Boeing, but the new deal is for the ground-launched mobile version of the anti-ship missile. According to Bloomberg, the sale will complete a deal approved by Congress in 2020. The Pentagon announced a $1.7 billion contract with Boeing on April 7th, but wouldn't say what the deal was for, but it was with Taiwan. The Harpoon deal has been cited by Congress as a part of what they call a $19 billion backlog in arms sales to Taiwan, although the weapons purchase typically take years to fulfill. So it's unclear when the weapons will get there, but they do say they're coming now counter. And of course, this takes us further away from the one China policy that has governed the U.S.-Beijing relationship, and of course puts us closer to war. We've had a lot of military officials, high-ranking officers, make very provocative statements about China over the past couple of years, and we have another one here now from Admiral John Aquiliano, the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and he told Congress on Tuesday that the U.S. must be ready to fight and win the war against China over Taiwan. He said, "I'm responsible for finding a way to prevent this conflict today, and if deterrence were to fail, to be able to fight and win." The comments are the latest example of the U.S. military officials speaking openly about the fact that they're pursuing a war against China or preparing for a war against China. The U.S. Army Secretary Christine Wormuth also said recently that the U.S. must be ready to beat China in a war in the Asia-Pacific by beefing up its military presence in the region.
If there's any one thing I would like to suggest to you as a young group, is to reassess what we've done, to reassess what you're getting. It's your country. You are free individuals. You're allowed to run for office. You're allowed to participate. You're even allowed to become libertarians. You should reassess and say, what about these treaties? Are they any good? We were attacked in Pearl Harbor. We went to war. We won the war, and you'd never know it. Japan now owns Waikiki Beach, and we're paying for all their defense. And they're killing us in the market. They lower their taxes. They subsidize their export, and we never stop. Their oil supply gets threatened in the Persian Gulf, so what do? We rush over there to protect their oil supply and endanger, really, the true free flow of oil out of the Persian Gulf. It's been much more dangerous since our Navy's been there. It's a foreign policy of folly. It's a foreign policy designed for war. And it's an economic policy designed to cause recession, depression, protectionism, and isolationism, and that's what we're going to get.
Right. What will happen if the House and the Senate can't agree? Well, the government will stop borrowing at some point, or does Janet Yellen have some tricks up her sleeve?
Two things will happen. Number one, she will continue on with what's called extraordinary measures, and that's where she has to make priorities on what they spend, right? So what will happen is you're going to postpone payment of interest on the bonds. That's really what happens because you pay everything else as it's due, and that's too. So I actually asked an individual came in to brief the Freedom Caucus about this. I said, so what happens if we don't pay, if we don't increase the debt ceiling? He thought about it for 2 minutes. I guess nobody ever asked, and he said, well, nothing. And I said, explain that to me, because I've been told that it'll be the big cataclysmic thing. He says, well, what happens is the bills get approved through OMB, they get forwarded to the Fed pays them. And that's just the way it is. Them. That's what he said. That's what he said. Well, I would stand by that too. Through Treasury, I guess they're authorized by Treasury to pay. So anyway, so that's what happens. So nothing really happens. People keep getting their checks.
Well, we know how the Fed pays them, not with cash, but by adding zeros to bank accounts. Has this been going on? Is this even worse than Ron Paul's wildest nightmares about the Fed? Now the Fed has been paying for appropriations when Congress hasn't authorized the debt ceiling to go up?
That's my understanding. I'm not saying I may misunderstand, but that's what this individual told us, and he had impeccable credentials. But I would just tell you what to add to your consternation here is, Judge, there are over 1,200. Yeah. You'll know why I don't sleep. So there are more than 1,200 agencies, departments, and programs that are unauthorized by Congress that are funded to the tune of $500 billion a year.
By the Fed?
Well, I can only assume because they just keep paying them. We've not appropriated and we've not authorized. If we have appropriated, we're appropriating to agencies that should have been sunsetted and that the Congress has not authorized to actually be in existence. Most people don't realize this. The U.S. Department of State has not been authorized or reauthorized by Congress in something like 30 years.
And how does Tony Blinken get a salary?
We just keep funding him. We just keep funding him. He shouldn't get a salary, but that's just
right. So is this debate about a debt ceiling just theoretical and fanciful? Because if the debt ceiling is not raised, the government will just keep spending money that fiat money that the Fed will create. I guess it creates it by adding zeros to a bank account somewhere, whether it's Chase Manhattan or whether it's the Treasury's bank account. Some bank account will just add zeros to it.
I would guess so. I read a report yesterday that said that Yellen is anticipating that the extraordinary measures will need to be repaid back, and that's she's anticipating $450 billion. So the extraordinary measures basically are kicking the can down the road. So, Judge, here's another way to look at it. We spend every month about $100 billion or more than we bring in revenue. There's only a couple months that we actually break even or are in the black in revenue, and this is one of them, April, because of tax. And you'll see, I think July and September because also quarterly. So those are the only months where we actually bring in enough to pay our bills. So they just keep adding to this debt. And I will just tell you, the way here's another way of looking at it. And then you'll really get to my consternation. So over 10 years, because everybody's talking about, we're going to do this in 10 years. And you and I both know nothing matters after year one because the next Congress can do whatever it wants to with year two. So the anticipation, if the debt and the spending continues to grow, you will add $22 to $25 trillion in debt to the national debt. So you go from 31 to somewhere around 52, 53, maybe a little higher. But if you enact all the measures that my colleagues are going to put forward, which I think it's a good place to start, but I told my colleagues, I said, we should be starting much more on the reduction side. We need to be doing that. But needless to say, it will impact it by $4 trillion.
So instead of being at 52 trillion, you're going to be at $48 trillion if this plan were to work the way it's being proffered.
And the interest on 48 trillion will be borne by generations of taxpayers as yet unborn.
Well, if you take the current 5%, the 5%, your interest is going to be $2 to $2.5 trillion a year just for the interest on that going forward. And what that does is it causes inflationary pressure, causes crowd out to the private capital markets, and quite frankly, unless our GDP can grow, we will have long since gone bankrupt. Quite frankly, because the debt to GDP ratio will be astronomical.
Unless we change our value, your job will be to decide what should the role of government be? What can we offer? Do we have to live up to all those treaties? Can we get out of those treaties? Can we have a different foreign policy? Should the role of government be there to guarantee that you can make a living again? Or is it going to guarantee that every year your Social Security tax is going to go up and every year your income tax is going to go up? That's what you're inheriting. So I challenge you to think about these issues and decide that there is a better way. And the better way is a wonderful, beautiful philosophy. It's the philosophy of freedom, something that was introduced to America a couple hundred years ago and was in many ways outlined in the form of our Constitution.
A partial solution or an invitation for a solution. And that's I wanted to make a comment about RFK's announcement, yesterday or the day before about running for the presidency. I have mixed feelings, obviously, because of what the Kennedys have gone through. But we have met RFK Jr., and he's been to our conferences. And he probably has some views that are different than ours in detail, but we certainly get along well with him. He's friendly, he's principled, he's anti-war, and the other thing that he comes across real strong, and that is he doesn't like corporatism. He doesn't like this combination. So therefore, pharmaceuticals would be in camp. So he is, and the issues that he has. He isn't in the middle of the road. He isn't saying, well, come a little over here. We can concede this and that. He took a principled position, both, on a corporatism and the anti-war position. So I'm very happy that he's doing that. And so we'll keep tabs. And who knows, if he wanted to talk with our viewers, I'd be open to having Robert on our program again someday.
These are the main points that RFK made. Ending the corrupt merger of corporations in the state, opposing lockdowns, which cost small businesses trillions. He also blamed Trump for going along with the bureaucrats on the lockdowns, supporting free market capitalism and limited government, conquering the children's chronic illness crisis, bringing the troops home, and openly discussing the war. Sounds pretty good to me, Dr. Paul.
Yeah, that does sound like a couple things I said when I was running.
Yeah, that's probably why we like it so much.
I don't want to pretend that I follow him on all the issues, but yeah, that sounded very, very good. And because even when we find the other candidates, they might have one thing they'll throw a bone. I feel like they're throwing a bone to us. And but how many of them would be based on principle? That is why they really fear somebody like Robert, because he's going to tell the truth. And we're going to talk a little bit about how they distort truth and put it into the Justice Department and get people into trouble and indictments and all this. And yet, I think the one thing is people might say about Robert, they say, you know what? I don't agree with him on all his things, but you can trust what he's going to say. So I'm looking forward to his campaign.
Yeah, and I think, and every time we mention RFK Jr., I'll get an email from someone saying, well, look, he said this about that. And my reaction to that would be two things. One, we're not endorsing him by any stretch. And two, obviously he's going to say some things that we don't like. I would be a little bit worried if he didn't, because that's just how it works. So it's not an endorsement, but at least he is talking about some issues, very, very unlike the rest of the campaigns.
And this whole thing of this indictment of these four people, do you think they're going to get a fair trial is what my point is.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the most disturbing stories that we've reported. And I honestly keep looking over it, reading over it. I've read the press release from the Justice Department, and I can't believe it's happening in the United States, to be honest. As bad as things are, I never would have imagined it. So what happened, there are 4 members of the African People's Socialist Party in Florida. They were indicted by the Justice Department, and they were charged with being involved in a, quote, foreign malign influence campaign. What they had actually done is they and of spreading Russian propaganda, conspiracy to spread Russian propaganda, and acting as a foreign agent without registering. And it would be a disgusting joke if it weren't for the fact that they are facing 10 years for the conspiracy charge and another 5 years for the failure to register charge. So these people are looking at 15 years in prison. And what is their crime? They expressed support for Russia, and they said the U.S. shouldn't be involved in Ukraine. That's absolutely constitutionally protected speech. There's no one who could say it is. The Justice Department's memo says that they are being charged because they weaponized the First Amendment in the service of another government. It's just astonishing that they would suspend the First Amendment on the grounds that someone, quote, weaponized it, when, of course, there are no limitations at all on the First Amendment. Of course, the only limitation is on government. So it's a very, very, very chilling and disturbing turn of events. They're charged with writing articles that contained Russian propaganda and disinformation. I don't know how you prove that. But Caitlin Johnstone, who also spoke at our conferences, and she's an Australian, she comes from the left, but it's kind of sad that it takes a foreign leftist to explain our own constitution to this government. Because here's what Caitlin wrote about the charges that they were spreading disinformation and propaganda. She said, it's important to note that this should not matter. Under the First Amendment, the government is forbidden to abridge anyone's freedom to speak however they want and associate with whomever they please, which necessarily involves being as vocally pro-Russia as they like and promoting whatever political agenda they see fit, whether that happens to advance the interests of the Russian government or not. She says, It's not unreasonable for the government to just dismiss the First Amendment. It's not reasonable for the government to just dismiss the First Amendment on the grounds that it's being weaponized. That should be a no-brainer. And it's just shocking to see the federal government believing that it can suspend the First Amendment by claiming that someone else is weaponizing it.
Because there's so many shortcomings there. But the justice system, really needs some overhauling. But I think a lot of people are very confused about it, and it's a PR game. What can we do? And all the distortion. Then you have the media out there propagandizing the lies and weaponizing these things. So it's up to the people who are telling the truth that they get a lot of microphone as they can get, and that means that we certainly want to help people who are seeking the truth, realizing that at least what we want is an honest discussion, and that's what they're doing right here. I think they're trying to trample the honest discussion, and that's very frustrating.
Yeah, I think what Americans have to ask themselves, do we want to live in a country where the government can throw you in jail for 15 years for saying something that the government doesn't want you to say, for holding a political view that the government doesn't want you to have? And that's what we're facing. Every single one of us could face these 15 years because every single one of us at some point expresses a view that the government doesn't support, whether it's on medicine, whether it's on a virus, whether it's on foreign policy. Everyone is, if this goes through, everyone is vulnerable. And they're going to pick the low-hanging fruit first. And I think this party, in a way, is that it's a small party. They're not powerful. They don't have tons of money. They're being made examples of for the rest of us to tell the rest of us, shut up. And this is a political party that was formed in 1972. They have been critical of U.S. foreign policy consistently since 1972, and no one has noticed. But now, all of a sudden, when they speak out against this war, the government comes down on them like a ton of bricks. I think there's a reason for that. There's a reason they're doing it. That the U.S. government is getting desperate. The Biden administration is getting desperate because its Ukraine policy is failing, and they're striking out not at Russia, but at America and Americans. And this is a very dangerous thing, Dr. Paul.
I think it would be quite proper that this year we read the Constitution. I think we should read it every 200 years, whether we like it or not. Let's look at the Constitution, figure it out, sit down and read it, and decide whether that's the kind of government you want. I happen to believe in limited government. I happen to believe in individual freedom, not only because of the moral principle behind it, but for the humanitarian aspects of what libertarianism brings. It brings a prosperous, free society. It brings you honest money. It brings you full employment. It brings you a system of government that allows people to have an incentive to get ahead. And most importantly, at least highly important, is the fact that it's a system of government that allows us the best chance for peace. And certainly in this age where we are threatened with a nuclear holocaust, we certainly don't need 20 or 30 or 40,000 more nuclear warheads. I think 100 or 2 of those might be plenty. And therefore, there's no reason to continue with this process of ever building up. So I say, look into these, make your decision, and please come down on the side of voting for freedom, vote for liberty, vote for the libertarians. I thank you very much.
All right, so the next one here, GOP lawmakers say that they won't support unrestrained Ukraine aid. So a group of Republican members of Congress have told President Biden that they will not support more unrestrained aid for Ukraine. I got this from a report in Responsible Statecraft. So the lawmakers said in a letter to President Biden, quote, a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine is not in the strategic interest of the United States, and it risks an escalation that could spiral out of control, end quote. The letter was signed by 3 Republican senators, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and J.D. Vance, and 16 Republican members of the House. They noted that recent aid the U.S. has pledged, including the M1 Abrams tanks, will require months of training, will take a long time to deliver, and they said that signals that the administration is ready for a war, for a long-term conflict. They said, quote, the current strategy of sanctions and drawn-out aid will only prolong the conflict, leading to escalation and more violence. Our national and economic security demand an alternative. Unrestrained U.S. aid for Ukraine must come to an end, and we will adamantly oppose all future aid packages unless they are linked to a clear diplomatic strategy designed to bring this war to a rapid conclusion, end quote. So the lawmakers warned of the risk of provoking a direct war with Russia. They said, quote, Russian tolerance for fighting a proxy war with NATO could run out at any point. The decision to invade Ukraine should be evidence enough of Putin's willingness to use military force and should give us pause in continuing to push the limits at the risk of catastrophe, end quote. But the next one, U.S. and its allies consider a ban of all exports to Russia. So this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And it says that the U.S. is in discussion with several Western partners about outright ending trade with Russia. The debate is occurring at the U.S.-led as the U.S.-led economic war on Russia has failed to stop Moscow's war machine in Ukraine. So according to Bloomberg, members of the G7 are considering banning exports to Russia outright. The debate is occurring among member states, the U.S., Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the European Union ahead of an international summit in May. So members of the G7 have maintained significant exports to Russia since Washington declared it would isolate Moscow using sanctions. According to trade data, $66 billion in goods have flowed to Russia from member states. The proposed ban would essentially switch the way Washington outlaws trade with Russia. Currently, the U.S. and its allies are blacklisting Russian products, companies, and individuals. And if this export ban is adopted, it will prohibit all trade with Moscow that is not explicitly exempted from Western sanctions. All right, the last one here. So this is from Li Fang, his Substack, and it's about a House Democrat that threatened Matt Taibbi with prosecution and imprisonment. So I haven't been following it. This is over the Twitter files. I haven't been following it too closely, but I know Taibbi addressed Congress on his reporting, and then he did this interview with this Mehdi Hassan guy over at MSNBC, and he accused him of getting some facts wrong, and it turned out He just had an abbreviation wrong in a tweet, and nothing that he said in his testimony to Congress was wrong. But this woman, this House, Stacey Plaskett, who's she's not a voting House representative. She's a delegate that represents the Virgin Islands. But she sent a letter to Matt Taibbi, basically threatening him with jail, saying that he intentionally provided false information. But Lee has been on top of this story, and he debunked that claim. But it's really something to see a member of Congress send a letter to a journalist and threaten them with jail.
You said you would not oppose such things as freedom of religion and to drink or whatever. What about minors and stuff? How do you feel about minors doing stuff like that?
Okay, he asked a very important question. Would we treat children differently than adults? Yes. I personally think that's a different ballgame. Children, belong to a family, and parents have a responsibility. But on all these things, I would say that things should be restricted because children can't make adult decisions. So if it has to do with drinking alcohol or smoking marijuana or whatever, I do not believe children should be involved. The same way with pornography, too. There should be a different system whereby children should be treated in such a way that we recognize that they're not able to make adult decisions.
But my goal has always been to understand the relationship of gold and silver. And the one thing about the things that have generally been forgotten about money is we know about supply and demand. Everybody knows about the rule, supply and demand. If you have one product, supply goes up, prices go down, that sort of thing. But it was not originally known, and it was only the Austrians that really emphasized the fact that the supply and demand of money is also important. So you have supply and demand of product, and the supply and demand of gold. And this is why preserving the value of dollars is difficult. If you have savings in dollars, the same way is what about the gold market? It's something you have to keep up with because Roosevelt, the first thing he did when he wanted to introduce a whole new concept of economic policy, the first thing he did was take all the gold from the American people. So it is an important issue. And once again, if you want to follow up and get some free information from Birch Gold, it's text Ron at 989898. There's trouble with the Fed, and there's trouble with the dollar. But the big thing is how do you predict when? If we knew next week, in 7 days, there was going to be an event that people were going to panic and race out of the dollar, which quite frankly is a possibility, even though I'm not predicting that, and I think it's not likely, but it could. And that's the reason we want to talk about it, because there is an element, when it comes to it, everything from the economic conditions here, war in Ukraine, our budgets discussion. There's so many things that have a very definite effect, on the value of the dollar and the value of gold. Chris.
Yes, and we you spoke about trends, and we noticed a trend. We were reading an article, I think it was on Kitco, and talking about the dollar, and its share of global reserves has plummeted. It was 73% in 2001, which is not that long ago. It dropped to 55% in 2021, and then in 2022, it's down to 47%. So in just 20 years, the dollar as a reserve currency has dropped from 73% to 47%. That is a major shift. And it's not surprising when you look at the last 20, 30 years of what the U.S. has done internationally. It's an empire, unfortunately, and empires need partners. And a lot of people around the world were involved with this. A lot of outside people. The American empire is not just Americans involved in this. Countries on the receiving end of all of our taxpayer money, they like that and want to keep that going. Just like Americans like stimulus checks and want to keep that going and complain when it has to stop. And if we are supposedly defending other nations, that means they don't have to defend themselves. They can use their money for whatever else they want. They don't have to worry about defense. The Americans will take care of it. The American taxpayer will take care of it. So empires, and that's why it takes so long for global currencies to finally go kaput, and they all do. They're without exception. What happens is people in the empire nation, they start overextending themselves. They want to rule the world. They want to spread wokeism. They go into all these different directions that stretch everybody thin, and eventually the rest of the world says, "Oh, whoa, we're not on board with all this." And then they start to peel themselves away. It first takes a few courageous ones to do it, bigger ones, and then the rest follow like dominoes. And, this 73% to 47% shows that the rest of the world has had enough of the American empire.
Very good. And, the conditions after World War II were conducive for the United States to pick up the role of issuing the reserve currency of the world, because we had the military power. We were essentially saved from the devastation of Europe and Asia over the war. And we had most of the gold. I mean, hundreds of tons of gold we had. So we were very wealthy and we were a productive nation. So it did make sense. But they didn't go to a gold standard. What they did, they went to a gold reserve standard. They say, we'll at the IMF meeting in 44, they say, what we'll do is we'll guarantee the dollar. Anybody from a foreign nation would come, and if you have a dollar, we're going to give you $35 an ounce. And then everybody traded in gold. Then later on, we made promises to Saudi Arabia that if you price your oil in dollars, we will guarantee your safety and security. Those things have started to change, because one thing is we live way beyond our means. So even between 1944 and 1971, there were a lot of predictions that Bretton Woods was fake. at $35 an hour because we just were running the printing presses like crazy. So common sense said, well, that's going to devalue, that's going to lower the value of the dollar. So in dollar terms, the price is going to go up, and it's eliminating the value that counts. It's not the price of gold so much. So that was predictable in 1971. And then to patch it up, of course, what we did was we had not been able to own gold as Americans, and what they did then was they allowed foreigners were still allowed to do that. But by 1971, we didn't even have enough money to honor our commitment. So in a way, it was a form of bankruptcy that we were declaring. We were in 1933 when we took the gold away from the people. We were declaring that we intend to bankrupt ourselves with printing too much money. That happened in 1971. We quit fulfilling our promises. That stabilized the world because people did believe that we would do it and follow through. So we say we did that, and it worked better than some would have predicted. So that to me is a big thing. But eventually, the predictions have come true. Can't work for a long time. It's going to end. And that's what we are seeing now because, we keep saying, when's it going to end? When's it going to end? But Chris, I think you and I can agree, and I imagine a lot of our viewers can agree, well, it's already starting, whether or not but it's not concluded yet because it'll be concluded when others use the currency. And that's what Chris was alluding to, that some countries are already doing it more and more. We have a series of countries that are transacting their international accounts in their own currencies and ignoring it. But I think the big thing there is we have made a lot of enemies in the world. And, we put sanctions. And if sanctions don't work on people obeying what we tell them to do in foreign policy, what we do is we bomb them. And lo and behold, then we're using our money. And we run up these deficits. We're in the middle. Once again, how are we going to keep ourselves from defaulting? We have to raise the national debt, which I see as a farce because we're defaulting on a daily basis. If the value of the dollar is going down, that means you're getting cheap dollars. And if you saved your money in dollars, your value of your dollar is going down. But the one thing is if that continues, what has always happened though is the dollar value of gold goes up. So it's one way a lot of people, including myself, we use that as a savings against this. But we're in the middle. We are defaulting. So everybody talks. It's just a technicality in language. People will say, well, are we going to default? No. One party will say, you guys are going to default. No, we will never default. Well, they're defaulting all the time. They've been doing it, especially, since Roosevelt. It's just, it manifests itself in different ways. But right now, it manifests itself by people now in a practical way, dealing with other currencies and groups of countries getting together. And it's not insignificant. It isn't just one or two countries. So I think very definitely we have moved in a direction of accelerating our default. But the big fear is when is it that people throw in the towel? They just throw it in. I can't keep up with this, and they're not going to save the day. And so the stalemate that they have in Washington, which goes on every couple of years to raise the debt limit, that may precipitate it, or another foreign policy failure. One individual that would, Chris, you were giving out those statistics, what's happened in this past year, and they said that was all because of Ukraine war. And Ukraine war had a lot to do with it, but I think it's bigger than that. I think it's our deficits for all kinds of reasons. I think it's the influence of wokeism, internationally wokeism, which has interfered with the soundness of our economy, but also the protection of our liberties. Who knows? Somebody could probably make a pretty good case and say this whole problem is your judicial system in the United States. It's a wreck. You can't depend on it, where at one time it was respected. So there are a lot of factors involved, but I think that I would take the position, Chris, that the default is ongoing and it's not going to slow up. It's going to get worse. And we have to look not only at the value of the dollar each day, what we have to look at is the dollar-gold relationship. It's almost always governments bend the rules. And that is why eventually the best standard of money, where you can define the currency and define the unit of account, would be that it's easily convertible into something that you can measure and you can define. And that is a coin that you could have. It doesn't mean you have to have a coin for every transaction. That's a fallacy. That's not true. But you want to measure every transaction, and people can loan money to each other in a way. How much are we going to do? And as long as you know the definition, and there's credit out there, just so the government doesn't have license to control, spin, run wars in the welfare state and think that they can run their empire. That is coming to an end. And when the empire ends, it'll be, it will be at the same time that the dollar is ending as well. They may come together one on top of the other. So I think we live in interesting times, but very dangerous. So I think the more knowledge and understanding we have, the better it is. But I would still vote first for liberty to solve most of our problems.
Consider a child to become an adult at what age?
That is not easy. We certainly consider a young person adult enough to drive a vehicle at the age of 16. They claim everybody's adult enough to die needlessly at the age of 18. So I think that it may vary from state to state. That would be a state determination, but somewhere in the 16 to 18-year range would be the period of time when we would decide that a person could make adult decisions.
I left academia fairly early on to go do other things, but you've been in it for quite some time. I mean, long enough to be able to have surveyed the profession over the course of decades and observed trends within it. What have you observed? I mean, not even just in the emphases of up-and-coming scholars, but also in terms of the quality of work being put out, the caliber of up-and-coming PhD students, or the factors that drive hiring decisions. Have any of these things evolved?
Well, I don't think any of them has improved.
Well, I knew that.
It does seem, again, that the kind of books that people who are in the prestige positions are producing are just not important. Or in some cases, they may seem important, but their approaches to the material they purport to be describing turn out to be flawed. Some whole subfields of American historiography are organized around guiding books that have basic flaws. So,
can you give me an example of that?
Well, the New History of Capitalism is one that's been in the news indirectly in recent years because some of the works that have been produced by the so-called new historians of capitalism have, among other things, driven the 1619 Project, the New York Times spectacular about the primary role of slavery in the history of the American economy. And it turns out that some of the books that were most relied on in producing that just are based on fundamental accounting errors. So you end up with what's in one case 6% of the American economy being depicted as 50% of the American economy. So the problem, well, what you'd think might happen in that kind of situation is that the book would be withdrawn from the market, or the person who had written it would lose his position or something, but nothing happens. Nothing happens. So I don't think that's that uncommon. I think we have a lot of people who focused on the trivial. And also, of course, we've had famous plagiarism scandals in recent years that have led to absolutely no consequences for the plagiarists.
Yeah.
That's awful. I don't know how else to describe that. So it's not only that people aren't really concerned with giving their fellow citizens accounts of the important aspects of the past. I'm thinking about American historiography, accounts of the past of the United States, but often when they do, they just tendentiously give them incorrect information. And I don't know really how to defend the enterprise generally. Its current state is pretty woeful.
Does libertarian philosophy deal with the questions of sexual freedom in this supposed age of AIDS?
How do we deal with the question of sexual freedom? Well, if we deal with it outside of the context of the problem of AIDS, sexual freedom is sexual freedom. I mean, we do not invade the bedroom. We have no laws against any type of sexual activity except the general principle that no force ever be used. That again doesn't mean that we condone what might go on, but it means that we would not have a law that that would require that we invade the bedroom and regulate it. Now, in the area of AIDS, it's clearly spread in such a way that most people can figure out how AIDS is spread and is not spread casually. But handling the problem of AIDS, I think, can be handled in a free market libertarian way differently than anybody else has proposed. First thing is I think the government should be out of it. The government has no ability to really regulate lifestyles and to do anything to prevent AIDS. Therefore, problems that are difficult to solve, we certainly don't want to turn them over to the government because they usually make these problems much, much worse. There shouldn't be government quarantines. But there certainly should be your right as an individual to quarantine yourself. Otherwise, you can discriminate against somebody who has AIDS. You don't have to associate with them. We would protect the businessman who might not want to hire somebody with AIDS. This whole idea that an AIDS victim has AIDS victims' rights, this is this distorted idea about civil liberties. There's only one kind of rights. There's no such thing as minority rights or women rights. There's only individual rights, and everybody should be treated equally, and everything has to be voluntary. But with AIDS, the businessman, the employer, has the right to protect himself if he wants. If it's his desire, he can sever the contract or not enter the contract and say, look, I don't want to deal with you. And he has the right to do that. You know, it's so bizarre today that some of the laws in the court rulings indicate that if you have hepatitis, you're not allowed to work in a restaurant. But if you have AIDS, you can't fire the person. That's the kind of inconsistency that wouldn't occur in a libertarian society. But you would be not compelled to associate with AIDS victims, and you should be protected against them if they are a threat to you through the voluntary means in a contractual arrangement. But no government quarantines, no compulsory testing, no force by the government.
I think they're wrong, and I'll get into that. But I think you have to fundamentally recognize that this is a deep-rooted cultural issue, you know? And if you're not addressing that problem, you're really not going to solve anything. And of course, as Ben points out, that, you know, like, hey, let's take a look at this. As the government has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, this problem has gotten worse and worse and worse. Now, why is that? Might there be a relation there? And of course, I'm going to argue that there is. But first, let's give Michael Knowles a chance to respond.
The government hasn't just grown. I guess that's the misconception at the heart of this. Yes, obviously, we're a much bigger country now, 330 million people. The federal government is much more powerful than it was some 200 years ago. But in other ways, the government has weakened. In other ways, the ability of local governments to control their own communities and set standards, that's weakened considerably. The ability of school boards to set curricula now is quite controversial. The rights of states have completely gone away. The states essentially have no real power anymore if they ever disagree with the federal government. So once again, I don't think this is an issue just of government getting really big or government getting really small. Conservatives have never supported small government. It's not possible for a country of 330 million people with a global empire to have a small government. What we can have is a limited government. So we want government to be within its natural and proper limits. And so when we're talking about the limits of the government, especially in a self-government such as ours, we have this question. Do we have the political right to set certain standards? Are our rights merely the individual licenses to pursue whatever delusional and depraved sexual identities that we want to pursue, or any other kind of fantastical ideas? Or do we have an exalted freedom that will suppress some of our lower appetites, but will give us a flourishing community? That latter idea was the idea that has animated our country, that made our country great, made our whole civilization great. As we've lost that, the government's gotten all out of whack, as you described, and the country's gone to pot.
All right, let's respond to all this. So I found this to be a kind of like shockingly shallow analysis. And one built off kind of critical errors or omissions, at least. So Michael Knowles, first of all, someone will have to explain to me the distinction between small government and limited government. If a government is limited, then presumably it's limited from growing into areas that are off limits, making it smaller. So that is just a distinction without a difference at all. But he kind of says, like, well, in some ways the government has gotten much bigger, but in other ways it hasn't. And yes, the federal government has expanded tremendously, but the ability of local communities to set standards and state governments and local governments has been tremendously weakened. And he almost puts that out there as if these are two things that just happened. Like they both just happened. So on one hand, this happened. On the other hand, this happened. And seemingly doesn't seem to recognize that they are clearly related. It's not as if coincidentally, as the federal government grew larger and larger and larger, local communities also at the same time coincidentally lost more and more of their authority. It's like, no, it was undermined by the federal government. That's what happened. The federal government came in and stripped them of these powers and said, we'll be making these decisions in Washington, D.C. So those two things are completely related. So it would seem to me quite self-evident that if what you want is for local communities to have more autonomy, then what you need is to have far less power in Washington, D.C., and that power returned to local communities. That, I think that's just obvious, and it was bizarre to me to hear him talk about that, these things that are so obviously connected, and say it as if they were just two things that happened to occur. Then he also mentions that, you know, you can't have a small government with the size of our population and a global empire, which is that is correct. You know, it's like, yeah, you can't have a global empire that has a small government. You need a pretty big government to rule the world. But that seems to lead to a question that Michael Knowles doesn't even seem to address. It's almost just like, well, that's a given. That's a given that we're the global empire, and so therefore we can't have a small government. And of course, the question that one should be asking themselves is, ought we be a global empire? And if you're talking about the original, as he says, like, forget his exact words, the original ideas that animated this great country, well, they sure as hell weren't being a global empire. In fact, all of our founders, to a man, I mean, they disagreed about a lot of things. They all agreed the last thing you want to be is a global empire. And if we are a global empire, then this experiment here has failed. So it's, you know, it's kind of amazing to hear him say that and not recognize that, yeah, that is actually the core of the problem here. The thing when I say that right-wingers need to learn their libertarian lesson is this. Giant superstates always work to undermine all of the things that Michael Knowles claims to care about. They're always going to work to undermine communities, religion, family, and tradition. And the reason is very simple, because all of those things are a hedge against big government. That's what you look at any of them, any giant superstate, they always try to undermine these cultural traditions, because these are the things that check you against state power. They don't like a society of devout religious people, because if you're like a devout Christian, then it's much less likely that you view Barack Obama as a god, because you already have a god. If you have a strong family, then it's much less likely that you're going to be dependent on the government, because you have a family you can be dependent on if you hit hard times. If you have a strong community, you don't really need a welfare state, because communities tend to take care of each other, and they know much better about who's actually, you know, like out of work because they're just a lazy bum, and who's out of work because, you know, they fell on hard times, or, you know, they have a legitimate issue or something like that. There's local communities who know the people within their community make these decisions much better than a federal government hundreds of miles away that gives the lazy bum and the guy who's actually falling on hard times the exact same handout, thus incentivizing you to be a lazy bum. But this is the direct, like the relationship is so direct here. It's not a coincidence that as the government grows bigger and bigger, the culture falls apart more and more. And then if conservatives and right-wingers do not recognize this, then they fail to recognize this at their own peril. This is the whole game. This is the whole game here. The more the government comes in, it crowds out communities, churches, localities, and traditional norms. You know, if you just think, if you remove the government, that these traditional norms were traditional norms, why would there be a tradition of getting married before you have kids? Well, because it's much harder to raise a kid on your own. It's much easier to do it if you have someone there who will help support you. However, if the government comes in and says, we'll support you if you're out on your own, you now disincentivize the traditional incentives. And this is true over and over and over again, every inch of government. From Social Security, which came in and like basically overtook the old retirement plan, which used to be your kids would take care of you. You're incentivized to have kids, to treat them fairly decently so that when they're adults, they want to take care of you. Well, now the government's going to force you to, you know, pay in your whole life. And so that incentive is pretty much gone. Of course, the welfare state creates all of these incentives. And I think more than that, there was something I was talking about this quite a bit in my in my speech that I gave in New York City at this Mises Caucus event just a few weeks ago. But there's also a big part of why the right-wingers lost this country was because they went all in on George W. Bush. And this is really what started off the 21st century, on such a bad note, is that basically all the evangelical Christians in the country supported George W. Bush. And he was the biggest disaster in our country's recent history. And then they had no seat at the table. They were in no position to lecture, the rest of America about how they were forgetting about their traditional norms. And they just lost their entire seat at the table. I mean, who the hell were you to lecture about what Jesus would want when what you decided Jesus wanted was to slaughter 1 million Iraqis and hand us a financial crisis? It's right-wingers and conservatives really need to learn this lesson. And unfortunately, far too few of them have. But this is the whole game. This is the whole game right here. It's this. If you want, you want to save the republic, you got to kill the empire. If you want to save the tradition, you have to drastically shrink the size and scope of government. It's the only way it's going to happen, because this is what's undermining it. And no, you're not going to keep the government this big and then change its incentives around to be pro-family and pro-religion or any of these pro-traditional norms, because that doesn't benefit a super state. It doesn't benefit them. This is why, like, you never heard like Stalin or Hitler urging all of his people to go to church. They weren't looking for you to go worship something else. They were looking for you to worship them, because that's how they maintain their power. Because the whole thing is that government is all an illusion. It's not real. It doesn't exist.
Yes.
I'd like to jump to your economic policies. And it seems to me that historical facts of the 1920s and 1930s seems to indicate that a free enterprise system led to the Depression, and the more that Hoover used free enterprise and the more right he went with his economic policy, the harder the Depression came. Could you come to terms with that?
Yes, I love that question. Because you are really, and I'm not saying this in a personally critical way, but you are expressing one of the common myths of 1980 college education. But I would recommend one textbook, because I can't fully answer this. I'll do my best. There's one textbook that if you're interested in that, and if let's say you took the position that you're asking me about and you're challenging me, and you want to really refute it, you have to read one textbook called The American Great Depression by Murray Rothbard. Because he turned me around, because I was raised to believe exactly as your question implied, is that capitalism and the gold standard caused the Great Depression. And that Herbert Hoover was a free market person who perpetuated the Depression because he was demanding capitalism and the gold standard and free markets. Nothing could be further from the truth. The full explanation of the business cycle has not occurred until the 20th century by von Mises, who was the 20th century leader of the Austrian school. Of course, he's the one who explains that the business cycle is caused by the Federal Reserve System. Creation of credit, the contraction of credit, the boom and the bust. So you have to look at monetary policy of the 1920s, again under a Republican administration. Rapid monetary expansion, inflation. Don't ever believe for a minute that inflation is price increases. That is one of the consequences of inflation. Inflation is the increase in the supply of money and credit. So we had the inflation of the 20s, that was setting the stage. We had the contraction of the credit by the Federal Reserve in 1929. They precipitated the crash. And then there was deflation. There was deflation because we were still loosely linked to the gold standard. But if you go back and look at what Hoover did, he did everything, maybe not as efficiently as Roosevelt did, but he imposed a lot of government restrictions and restraints, introduced a lot of the programs that Roosevelt just made much bigger. So he was a first of our presidents since George Washington ever to impose government intervention in the economy trying to take care of the Depression. In 1921, for instance, 10 years before, there was a depression, but it lasted 6 to 12 months because the government just kept their hands off. But Hoover did not keep his hands off. The inflation of the money supply was the main culprit. Look at the history of the business cycle since the creation of the Federal Reserve, since 1913. We had the inflation of the war, depression of 21, the inflation of the 20s, depression of the 30s, and a business cycle all the way through. Great crash in 1987. It's on and on. But I suggest that you read Murray Rothbard. It's a great book, and I'm convinced he'll convert you as he converted me.
Are you talking about Hoover's policies, like in helping the banks? Or what other policies?
Government intervention. He kept wages up, and he had farm programs and different things. He had many, many different programs that he introduced. But the artificial keeping up of wages, where the correction wasn't allowed to occur, so very many of these programs he introduced.
You said, I was reading your literature here, and you said that space exploration should be open to the public and all. Does that mean you don't want the government to be in it? And what about things like scientific research and stuff? Would there be government grants for that, or would it have to be privately funded?
On yes and no on that, and I'll sort it out. The space program, when it's for only economic development and when it's subsidizing companies that want to put up satellites, no, the government shouldn't be involved in that. But space technology, I think, is a legitimate defense expenditure, knowledge of space, because we live in a space age. It makes a lot more sense to me to bring World War II type foot soldiers home from Japan and put more money into a space defense system. That, to me, seems to be logical. On R&D, only for the purpose of national defense, R&D ought to come from business people and universities and the people who should be involved. It should never be political. Politicians, believe me, all you have to do is go down to Washington, you'll find out, politicians are always political. I mean, they're not wise. They don't have great wisdom of knowing who should get the research funds. So I would say that it'd be much better off, there'd be a lot more funds. That would be the magnificent part about it. The country would be wealthier, the corporations wouldn't be in debt, and they're more likely to fund the universities. So they shouldn't be in it just for the sake of research. But if it's space technology, yes, I would believe that there would be certainly some of that in a libertarian society.
Yes, I agree a lot with what you say about humanitarian policy at home, but I don't see the practical application of a libertarian president in the United States. I think it would be too much of a shock for the entire world to have one of the greatest countries ever to change in such a radical way. And, you know, the American way is such a balance. You say the Constitution is, you know, we should go back to what the Constitution said. Well, they had no idea what they were getting into. They left some room for growth, but they had no idea what would happen. And I just don't see the practical application of a libertarian president.
Okay, but they really didn't leave room to destroy the principle of freedom, you know, the concept of individual rights and the purpose of government. You say it would be a radical change. I think the extremists are in government. How can you say somebody who wants a balanced budget is a radical extremist and wants these radical changes when we get a conservative president that gives us triples the national debt in 6 years and runs up a deficit in 1 year of $220 billion? That to me is extremism and is very dangerous. You say, well, they might not be able to accept these changes from the status quo, which I would grant there will be some changes. But you shouldn't compare that to the problems of accepting these changes. You ought to compare it to what it's like when all the people of this country get a Social Security check and it doesn't buy anything. Look at what happens when you have inflation of 20 or 30 or 40% in a year, and our unemployment rate's at 25%. That's what you have to compare it to. We have to prevent these great problems coming by offering up sound economic policies. So I think the real calamity is not doing anything. Yes, there's going to be adjustments, but it's sort of like you telling me that the drug addict doesn't want to get off drugs because he gets sick, he gets uncomfortable, and he doesn't feel good when he's trying to get off drugs. Certainly he doesn't feel good. And the economy is not going to feel real good when you quit feeding it deficit financing and inflation. But what happens to the drug addict if he doesn't stop? He dies. And that's the kind of a system we have here today. Now, if you say that that's all poppycock, if you say, no, I don't agree with that, we have a healthy economy, and you believe that nonsense of the supply-siders, then you just sit back and forget about it because everything is going to be okay. Instead of this being something threatening, to me, I see this as conciliatory and the only compromise that can work. Let me give you an example. The Democrats and the Republicans are always arguing about the budget deficits, and they always get together because they both endorse government spending. One for big business and military-industrial complex, the other for poor man's welfare. And they get together and they always raise both. I mean, that always happens. It never really gets cut. The Libertarian is the only one that has a reasonable chance of going to the conservative and say, you know, I do support you. I think you're on the right track on free enterprise and that welfare is out of control. And I can go to the liberal and say to the liberal, yes, I agree with you. There's too much spending in the Pentagon. So I can bring these people together with the conservative and liberal. All they're going to do is bicker, and they're going to raise it. And I'm also convinced, for what I've stated earlier, that under the system of non-intervention, you're less likely to have war and conflict.
It seems that the Libertarian ideology is very caring, but yet how is the Libertarian Party going to take care of the people that cannot provide for their own individual freedoms, like, let's say, the old or the mentally retarded or the handicapped? I mean, if you abolish the welfare system, who's going to take care of those people?
Well, the first thing is you'd have a lot less. I mean, if government intervention takes a country that has a 3% need and turns it into a 20% need, so we've immediately eliminated 17%. Your question is there will always be somebody in need. Well, we cannot violate our principles. We cannot violate the Constitution. And we think that if we get involved with the government, we're going to make the problem worse. So we don't even think about that. We think that people are more likely to be taken care of if the country's prosperous and they have jobs. So therefore, it will take a charitable nature. The families have to do it. The communities have to do it. The church has to do it. But you have a much better chance. It isn't going to be utopia. But at least you wouldn't have abject poverty and suffering in business cycle and stock market crashes. I mean, the alternative is so much better, but far from utopia. I mean, I'm not proposing utopia, but what I'm saying is there's going to be a much better chance for you to help take care of that problem because you're likely to have a job in a libertarian free market. So therefore, you can help take care of some people.
Yeah, I was wondering if you'd expand a bit on your comment about that you don't care if what people choose to smoke. I was wondering, does that mean you're opposed to like national campaigns such as Just Say No that tries to educate the youth against the use of drugs and the problems that arise?
I've been very much involved in drug education in my local community. My wife works a whole lot, and we've raised 5 children that didn't use drugs. And I, as a physician, work very hard to, deal with the drug problem. So my motivations and my efforts have been there. I would always say that is the way. Just Say No programs is great, but I would never use taxpayers' money to do it. What I would do is get what so many have already done. Movie stars and athletes have been participating, and I'm sure I hope they don't get a lot of money for those ads. My assumption would be that they feel strongly about this and they're doing something to try to get people to just say no. I think that's a wonderful system, and that's the way it should be. But this drug culture is a reflection of a societal problem rather than the lack of strong laws. I mean, just look at the drug problem. That is a disaster. All the money that we're spending doesn't do any good whatsoever. Our CIA has been known to be a dealer in drugs and involved with drugs. The drug laws have literally been accused of being the cause of 50% of our crime in this country. The terrorist nation love the drug laws because they can make so much money off the drugs. The drug dealers, what would you do if they didn't have drug laws? The drug dealers would all be out of business. I mean, it is such a disaster. And there's no evidence whatsoever to prove that there's more drug usage because if they were legal. Matter of fact, again, back to 1914, I think it was 1914 of the Harrison Act. Before that, Americans smoked coke and drank coke and did all this stuff. And I mean, we weren't a nation of heroin addicts, even when there weren't laws against it. So that is a serious social problem. My argument would be, I don't condone any of that, but I would say the solution comes a different way, without coercion. If there's somebody holding their hand in the back, I can't quite see them. Let's try back here.
Can we have countries that are equally and stuff all around the world, and we could have freedom and do what we want to do and stuff?
I can't quite hear that question. Somebody wants to state it for me if they heard it.
Can we have equally countries all around the world and have freedom and do what we want to do?
Well, we could hope that, and I think the best way to have freedom around the world is for us to set a good example. Just like an individual in a community, he can't go into somebody else's house and tell them how they should live, but a leader in a community can set an example so others may follow. So we as a country, whether it has to do with an economic system or a monetary system or the way we act and behave, and that is following the rules of freedom. If we set a good example and show that it's worked, others will follow us. If we as a leader, and we are, if we set the example that we should run our economy poorly and inflate the currency and cause a lot of problems, others follow us too. So the best way to spread freedom around the world would be to set a good example.
would that mean that you'd want to pull away from being a counterbalancer force against the Soviet Union, pull away from NATO? Because that's what you were saying, but you were giving, Japan as an example of a country that doesn't have a strong defense because it's written in their constitution, but then we strongly help NATO and stuff, and we are the active force against communism in the world. What would you say about that?
I think the best way to develop a stronger anti-communist position is to accept the libertarian position. I think the current position is very, very weak. There's a lot of talk about anti-communism, but quite frankly, if you look at the record, you will find out that funding of the communists did not go down under the Reagan administration. All administrations continue funding to the Soviet bloc nations, and that now that we've signed this treaty with the Soviets, they are going to now get even more funding. The foreign policy that I described earlier, where we disrupt these countries, that literally sets the stage for communism to grow. A libertarian president would certainly clean out the State Department. I mean, I would not have a State Department. Of course, I would have a very small State Department, but I certainly would get rid of the left-leaning members of the State Department who support governments like Mozambique. No, and I don't believe we need to be in NATO. I think that there's very strong evidence, a lot of writing on this today by many individuals. And there's a book out, it says, it's entitled How NATO Weakens the West. And literally, the more you subsidize them, the more dependent they are on us. If we would back off, I think Europe would become much stronger, much more self-sufficient, and there may be 3 powers in the world, which to me would be a benefit rather than 2 conflicting powers. You want to follow up?
Well, that's an interesting idea about the European community, but I would think that you would have to worry about a conventional force sweep, or even something worse than that, where we would lose Europe, as a it's better to have people that are semi-supportive of us there than people that would not be supportive.
Okay, you have a legitimate point. I don't happen to agree that that's what happened, but let's assume that you are right. The next question you have to ask is, let's say that there is a sweep. The Soviets moved into West Europe. Are you willing to give your life and ask everybody in this room to give their life to go and fight the cause? Do I have, as a politician, the right to confiscate your life and send you over there in the name of preserving freedom in America when it might not have anything to do with America? It may be a just cause, but just as not smoking and not drinking and using drugs is a just cause, that doesn't allow me, the government, to be involved. Just because there's somebody poor doesn't give me the right to intervene in the economy. So these just causes, I think it would be a just cause if the communist government was overthrown in the Soviet Union right now. But the just cause is not a legitimate excuse for doing this. I happen to believe that strategically it would not happen, but even if it did, I would say that I'm not going to draft you to do it.
What about keeping our nuclear forces over there so then the likelihood of this happening would be less so?
Again, if there's going to be a fight over there, I just assume us not be involved. So I would say the nuclear forces need to be here. They turn on us. The French have already turned on us. The Spanish are throwing us out even this very month. They've asked us to take out our 72 F-16s that we've had there. They don't even appreciate us. We decide, erroneously by the way, to go down and bomb Gaddafi for something that nobody proved in the court what he did. We go down there and kill his kid, and we try to fly over Europe and they won't even let us. So we buy nothing. We buy nothing but debt for you in the so-called idea of protecting Europe for the safety of the world. It doesn't work. I think Europe would be much stronger by saying to the Europeans, look, we're going to leave in 5 years. We're going to save some money, and we believe you can take care of yourself. France has been doing it. Spain doesn't want us there any longer, and we're just coming home. And I believe it is the best way. And even if, again, if you don't agree on the principle of it, I mean, we have to do some cutting. There's no money left, and something has to be cut back. And again, there's no way. Reagan lost the argument. He said, we'll cut welfare and raise the military. Well, welfare wasn't cut and the military went up. So the liberals might get in and say, well, we're going to cut military and raise the welfare. I say the only answer is the libertarian who would come up with a sensible economic policy and a sensible foreign policy and say, let's get back to basic economics and use the arithmetic.
I see your logical thought pattern, but still, I see a world that would develop where it would be, the whole world would be, if you're just so far into letting, the scenario would be that the Soviets would run rapid, so then the whole world would be us against them.
Well, that I don't believe, because I don't think the communist system is strong enough to feed themselves. But you have to defund them. I mean, we continue like Solidarity was about to be a major political force, and what did the Reagan administration immediately do? Through the Export-Import Bank and the Commodity Credit Corporation, they ran to bail out the government of Poland. Why? Because they cared about freedom? No, to protect the bankers that the Polish government owed money to. That's what directs your foreign policy. It has very little to do with communism, the threat of communism. Why did we invade Grenada? To stop communism? No, it was to cover up the disaster in Beirut. To cover up that major disaster. Why do we continue to fund them if they're serious about it? Take away all the funds. They can't even feed themselves. They can't even win in Afghanistan. But they're going to do a lot more as long as we support them, and we're getting ready to send them more money. That's why the treaty is so bad. Up on top.
Yeah, maybe you addressed this. I came in a little late. How do you deal with the fact that you're so unelectable? So unelectable. I mean, I haven't heard your name.
I'm not convinced yet.
So you're not. I think many people I haven't even heard your name until tonight. You're not out milking cows.
You'll never forget it.
You're not out milking cows. You're not out on the trail. You really feel you have a great chance? I mean, maybe there are people who like your ideas.
No, I think there are a lot of people who do, because we've done some testing. And you have a good point. I think I'm not going to be naive and say that I'm on the verge of victory. But if we take these positions and line them up and don't put any labels on them and just ask you, do you believe in free enterprise? Do you believe in individual liberty to lead your life as you want to? And do you believe we ought to change our foreign policy where we don't get suckered in and pay for all the defense of all our rich allies and continue to support communism and the banker system? The American people, yes, 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 they're 80, 90% who agree with these ideas. But as soon as we put labels on them and we talk about political system and voting, yes, we have a difficult time. But that's what this year is all about. The party's been around since 1972. It was the first time we had a nominee. We were on 2 ballots. We're expecting to be on 100 ballots this year. I expect to be in the debates. I was in New York yesterday. I had an hour interview with Bill Buckley. Things are just coming together for us. C-SPAN's been very generous. They've covered the race. Cable News Network has covered the race. No, I'm not on the evening news. But I am also convinced that there's a serious problem in this country and that we have some very serious, thoughtful answers to the problem. So it takes work and effort. It takes a political movement. But the best ally we have for accomplishing what we're trying to do are the Democrats and the Republicans. I mean, they're just doing a wonderful job for us because everybody's getting so turned off. And, I mean, Gary Hart's the leader of the Democrats today. And what kind of Reaganite is going to believe George Bush is going to fulfill the role that Ronald Reagan couldn't even fulfill? I mean, people aren't voting anymore. They're very disgusted. The turnouts are lower than ever. Very few people identify themselves as Republicans or Democrats. And here we are in the midst of caucuses and early primaries, and we're dealing with 5 and 10% of the people participating. The majority of the people are thinking along these lines, but your point is correct. I haven't gotten the message out yet, but that's my whole purpose, the intention and the goal, of course. And if the people want it, it will certainly help. I believe I deserve to be on the debates come November, October, November, whenever the debates occur. And I think it's very important. I think the American people, they don't necessarily deserve me, but they deserve to hear the ideas that I'm talking about.
This relates to the history of your party, which started in 1971. I came to listen to Ed Clark back in 1980 and supported him, voted for him in the election. And the question relates to during your candidacy and prior to that, you were elected to Congress, and your voice was actually heard during that period of time. I mean, you were actually able to vote, able to vote and make a decision. If you're not elected, and if members of your party are not elected, then that voice is not heard. Why would these people here, myself or anyone else, try to get involved in that political process where the odds are greatly enhanced if they get involved in a political party where if they are elected, their voice will be heard?
I don't think their voice will be heard, and I think their vote will be wasted, because there is no difference between the two parties. They both endorse the philosophy of intervention. And no matter whether you vote for the conservative or the liberal, if you vote for the conservative to reduce deficit, it doesn't happen, or if you vote for the liberal to decrease the chances of a war, that won't happen either. So they're wasting their votes. So therefore, their only option is to join us and work in our efforts until we are elected.
The parties right now, you're correct. I don't see a lot of difference in a lot of those members, but your party itself has members like yourself and Russell Means. If people that, as far as the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, if I have a libertarian attitude, which I do, and I'm a member of a political party, it seems to me if I am elected to a state legislature or whatever political process I would be in, that it would be greatly enhanced.
Well,
that's my point.
If that is your point, that if you say that you might be considering running for office and you have very libertarian views, does that mean that your only option would be to come and join the Libertarian Party? I think I have to be realistic because I've done both. And I ran as a Republican with libertarian views and hopefully had some positive influence and a positive impact. And yet the decision I made was a personal one, which is important. So if somebody else, if they're believing the same thing and they're going to go about it a different way, I'm not going to have a lot of strong criticism, especially if they're successful. But my reason for changing was historical, in the sense that I believe in looking at monetary history, since I've studied a lot of monetary history, is that big things are about to happen. And therefore, I don't want to, I could have stayed in the U.S. Congress as a Republican, but I wanted to make more points and to deliver the message differently. I want to have more of an impact. It doesn't mean that that individual who has libertarian views that would run and get elected, I cannot be critical of that, but I think the real impact has to be, especially for me, to say that the message of freedom, the message of liberty, has to be delivered to the American people in a different way than through the Republican Party.
I'm sure I'll have more questions, but time is a scarce resource, so I'd like to take this time to thank Ron Paul for coming here.
It's great. I really enjoyed being with you. Thank you.